In spite of the season, it was uncomfortable weather, and the temper of the town was as uncomfortable as the weather. As time went on, few people were to be seen about the streets, but there was a run on the gunmakers and swordsmiths. By day no cheerful shouts or songs rang out, but children of 6 or 7 years of age would go hand in rows down the street in the evenings, singing Maria pour la patrie to its own beautiful, affecting melody. But these were the only gentle sounds one heard. Gradually, the very air seemed to be reeking with terror and frenzy. Exasperation rolled up once more, like a thick, black stream, against the emperor, against the ministers and generals, and against the Prussians, whom people thought they saw everywhere. 30 foreigners were requested to leave Paris, so that, in the event of a siege, the city might have no unnecessary mouths to feed. Simultaneously, in Trochu's proclamation, it was announced that the enemy might be outside the walls in 3 days. Under such circumstances, the town was no longer a place for anyone who did not wish to be shut up in it. One night at the end of August, I traveled from Paris to Geneva. At the departure station, the thousands of German workmen who had been expelled from Paris were drawn up, waiting, herded together like cattle, a painful sight. These workmen were innocent of the war, the defeats, and the spying service of which they were accused. Now they were being driven off in hordes, torn from their work, deprived of their bread, and surrounded by inimical lookers on. As it had been said that trains to the south would cease next day, the Geneva train was overfilled, and one had to be well satisfied to secure a seat at all. My traveling companions of the masculine gender were very unattractive. An impertinent and vulgar old Swiss, who, as it was a cold night, and he had no traveling rug, wrapped himself up in 4 or 5 of his dirty shirts, a most repulsive sight. A very precise young Frenchman, who, without a vestige of feeling for the fate of his country and nation, explained to us that he had long had a wish to see Italy, and had thought that now, business being in any case at a standstill, the right moment had arrived. The female travelers in the compartment were a Parisian, still young, and her bright and charming 15-year-old daughter, whose beauty was not unlike that of Emile Masson, the lovely actress at the Théâtre du Gymnase. The mother was all fire and flame, and raved, almost to tears, over the present pass, cried shame on the cowardice of the officers for not having turned out the emperor. Her one brother was a prisoner at Königsberg. All her male relations were in the field. The daughter was terror-struck at the thought that the train might be stopped by the enemy, which was regarded as very likely but laughed at times, and was divided between fear of the Prussians and exceeding anxiety to see them. J'aimerais bien pouvoir dire que j'ai vu des Prussiens. At one station some soldiers en route, with torn and dusty clothes, got into our carriage. They looked repulsive, bespattered with mud and clay. They were in absolute despair, and you could hear from their conversation how disorganized discipline was, for they abused their officers right and left, called them incapable and treacherous, yet themselves gave one the impression of being very indifferent soldiers. The young sergeant major who was leading them was the only one who was in anything like spirits, and even he was not much to boast of. It was curious what things he believed. Marshal Leboeuf had had a Prussian officer behind his chair, disguised as a waiter at Metz, and it had only just been discovered. Russia had lent troops to Prussia and put them into Prussian uniforms, otherwise there could not possibly be so many of them. But Rome, too, was responsible for the misfortunes of France. The Jesuits had planned it all, because the country was so educated, they never liked anybody to learn anything. After Culas commenced the journey through the lovely Jura Mountains. On both sides, an immense panorama of high, wooded mountain ridges, with poverty-stricken little villages along the mountain sides. At Bellegarde, our passports were demanded. No one was allowed to cross the frontier without Themis' stupid arrangement. The Alps began to bound our view. The train went on, now through long tunnels, now between precipices, now again over a rocky ridge, whence you looked down into the valley where the blue-green Rhone wound and twined its way between the rocks like a narrow ribbon. The speed seemed to be accelerating more and more. The first maize field, slender poplars without side branches but wholly covered with foliage, stood bent almost into spirals by the strong wind from the chinks of the rocks. The first Swiss house. 31. There was Geneva, between the Alps, divided by the southern extremity of Lake Leman, which was spanned by many handsome bridges. In the center, a little isle with Rousseau's statue. A little beyond, the Rhone rushed frothing and foaming out of the lake. From my window I could see in the distance the dazzling snow peak of Mont Blanc. After Paris, Geneva looked like a provincial town. The cafés were like servants' quarters or corners of cafés. There were no people in the streets, where the sand blew up in clouds of dust till you could hardly see out of your eyes, and the roads were not watered. In the hotel, in front of the mirror, the New Testament in French, bound in leather, you felt that you had come to the capital of Calvinism. The streets in the old part of the town were all up and down hill. In the windows of the booksellers' shops, there were French verses against France, violent diatribes against Napoleon III, and outbursts of contempt for the nation that had lost its virility and let itself be cowed by a tyrant. By the side of these, portraits of the freethinkers and liberals who had been driven from other countries and found a refuge in Switzerland. I sailed the lake in every direction, enraptured by its beauty and the beauty of the surrounding country. Its blueness, to which I had never seen a parallel, altogether charmed me in the changing lights of night and day. On the lake, I made the acquaintance of a very pleasant Greek family, the first I had encountered anywhere. The eldest daughter, a girl of 14, lost her hat. I had a new silk handkerchief packed amongst my things and offered it to her. She accepted it and bound it round her hair. Her name was Maria Cumellas. I saw for the first time an absolutely pure Greek profile, such as I had been acquainted with hitherto only from statues. One perfect, uninterrupted line ran from the tip of her nose to her hair. 32. I went for excursions into Savoy, ascended La Grande Salve on donkey back, and from the top looked down at the full length of the Leman. I drove to the valley of Chamonix, 68 miles, in a diligence and four. About every other hour we had relays of horses and a new driver. Whenever possible, we went at a rattling gallop. Halfway I heard the first Italian. It was only the word quattro, but it filled me with delight. Above the high, wooded mountains, the bare rock projected out of the earth at the very top. The wide slopes up which the wood ascended, until it looked like moss on stone, afforded a view miles in extent. The river Arve, twisting itself in curves, was frequently spanned by the roadway. It was of a grayish-white and very rapid but ugly. Splendid wooden bridges were thrown over it, with abysms on both sides. Midway, after having for some time been hidden behind the mountains, Mont Blanc suddenly appeared in its gleaming splendor, positively tiring and paining the eye. It was a new and strange feeling to be altogether hemmed in by mountains. It was oppressive to a plain dweller to be shut in thus, and not to be able to get away from the immutable sheet of snow with its jagged summits. Along the valley of the stream, the road ran between marvelously fresh walnut trees, plane trees, and avenues of apple trees, but sometimes we drove through valleys so narrow that the sun only shone on them 2 or 3 hours of the day, and there it was cold and damp. Savoy was plainly enough a poor country. The grapes were small and not sweet. Soil there was little of, but every patch was utilized to the best advantage. In one place a mountain stream rushed down the rocks. At a sharp corner, which jutted out like the edge of a sloping roof, the stream was split up and transformed into such fine spray that one could perceive no water at all. Afterwards, the stream united again at the foot of the mountain and emptied itself with frantic haste into the river, foaming grayish-white, spreading an icy cold around. The changes of temperature were striking. Under shelter, hot summer, 2 steps further, stern, inclement autumn, air that penetrated to the very marrow of your bones. You ran through every season of the year in a quarter of an hour. The other travelers were English people, all of one pattern, unchangeable, immovable. If one of them had buttoned up his coat at the beginning of the drive, he did not unbutton it on the way, were he never so warm, and if he had put leather gloves on, for 10 hours they would not be off his hands. The men yawned for the most part, the young ladies jabbered. The English had made the whole country subservient to them, and at the hotels 1 Englishman in this French country was paid more attention to than a dozen Frenchmen. Here I understood 2 widely different poems, Hoche's Swiss Peasant and Björnson's Over the Hills and Far Away. Hoche had felt this scenery and the nature of these people by virtue of his Norwegian birth and his gift of entering into other people's thought. Björnson had given unforgettable expression to the feeling of imprisoned longing. But for the man who had been breathing street dust and street sweepings for 4 months, it was good to breathe the strong, pure air, and at last see once more the clouds floating about and beating against the mountain sides, leaning, exhausted, against a declivity and resting on their journey. Little children of 8 or 10 were guarding cattle, children such as we know so well in the north, when they come with their marmots. They looked, without exception, like tiny rascals, charming though they were. I rode on a mule to Montanvert, and thence on foot over the Mer de Glace, clambered up the steep mountainside to Chapeau, went down to the Crystal Grotto, and rode from there back to Chamonix. The ride up in the early hours of the morning was perfect, the mountain air so light, the mists parted, the pine trees round the fresh mountain path exhaled a penetrating fragrance. An American family with whom I had become acquainted took 3 guides with them for 4 persons. One worthy old gentleman who was traveling with his young daughter would not venture upon this feat of daring, but his daughter was so anxious to accompany us that when I offered to look after her, she was entrusted to my care. I took 2 mules and a guide, thinking that sufficient. From Montanvert and down to the glacier, the road was bad, a steep, rocky path with loose, rolling stones. When we came to the ice sea, the young lady, as was natural, took the guide's hand, and I, the last of the caravan, strode cautiously along, my alpenstock in my hand, over the slippery, billow-like ice. But soon it began to split up into deep crevasses, and farther on we came to places where the path you had to follow was no wider than a few hands' breadth, with yawning precipices in the ice on both sides. I grew hot to the roots of my hair, and occasionally my heart stood still. It was not that I was actually afraid. The guide shouted to me, "Look neither to right nor left, look at your feet and turn out your toes." I had only one thought, not to slip, and out on the ice I grew burningly hot. When at last I was across, I noticed that I was shaking. Strangely enough, I was trembling at the thought of the blue, gaping crevasses on both sides of me, down which I had barely glanced, and yet I had passed them without a shudder. The beginning of the crossing had been comparatively easy. It was only that at times it was very slippery. But in the middle of the glacier, progress was very uncomfortable. Moraines and heaps of gigantic blocks lay in your path, and all sorts of stone and gravel, which melted glaciers had brought down with them, and these were nasty to negotiate. When at last you had them behind you, came Le Mauvais Pas, which corresponded to its name. You climbed up the precipitous side of the rock with the help of an iron railing drilled into it, but foothold was narrow, and the stone damp, from the number of rivulets that rippled and trickled down. Finally, it was necessary at every step to let go the railing for a few seconds. The ascent then, and now, was supposed to be quite free from danger, and the view over the glaciers which one gained by it was a fitting reward for the inconvenience. Even more beautiful than the summit of Mont Blanc itself, with its rounded contours, were the steep, grey, rocky peaks, with ice in every furrow, that are called l'Aigle du Dru. These mountains, which as far as the eye could range seemed to be all the same height, although they varied from 7,000 to 14,800 feet, stretched for miles around the horizon. The ice grotto here was very different from the sky-blue glacier grotto into which I had wandered 2 years earlier at Grindelwald. Here the ice mass was so immensely high that not the slightest peep of daylight penetrated through it into the excavated archway that led into the ice. It was half dark inside, and the only light proceeded from a row of little candles stuck into the crevices of the rock. The ice was jet black in color, the light gleaming with a golden sheen from all the rounded projections and jagged points. It was like the gilt ornamentation on a velvet pall. When I returned from Chamonix to Geneva, the proprietor of the hotel was standing in the doorway and shouted to me, "The whole of the French army, with the emperor, has been taken prisoner at Sedan." "Impossible," I exclaimed. "It is quite certain," he replied. "It was in the German telegrams, and so far there has not come a single unveracious telegram from the Germans." The next day, a Genevese paper published the news of the proclamation of the Republic in France. Simultaneously arrived a letter from Julius Lange, attacking me for my miserly city politics, seriously complaining that our declaration of war against Prussia had come to nothing, and hoping that my stay in France had by now made me alter my views. In his opinion, we had neglected an opportunity of rebellion that would never recur. 33. Lake Léman fascinated me. All the scenery round looked fairy-like to me, a dreamland in which mighty mountains cast their blue-black shadows down on the turquoise water, beneath a brilliant, sparkling sunshine that saturated the air with its coloring. My impressions of Lausanne, Chillon, Vevey, Montreux were recorded in the first of my lectures at the university the following year. The instruments of torture at Chillon, barbaric and fearsome as they were, made me think of the still worse murderous instruments being used in the war between France and Germany. It seemed to me that if one could see war at close quarters, one would come to regard the earth as peopled by dangerous lunatics. Political indifference to human life and human suffering had taken the place of the premeditated cruelty of the Middle Ages. Still, if no previous war had ever been so frightful, neither had there ever been so much done to mitigate suffering. While fanatic Frenchmen on the battlefields cut the noses off wounded Germans and mutilated them when they could, and while the Germans were burning villages and killing their peaceful inhabitants, if one of them had so much as fired a shot, in all quietness the great societies for the care of the wounded were doing their work. And in this, Switzerland especially bore the palm. There were two currents then, one inhuman and one humane, and of the two, the latter will one day prove itself the stronger. Under Louis XIV, war was still synonymous with unlimited plundering, murder, rape, thievery, and robbery. Under Napoleon I, there were still no such things as ambulances. The wounded were carted away now and again in wagons, piled one on the top of each other, if any wagons were to be had. If not, they were left as they lay, or were flung into a ditch, there to die in peace. Things were certainly a little better. 34. In Geneva, the news reached me that in spite of a promise Hall, as minister, had given to Hoche, when the latter asked for it from me, I was to receive no allowance from the educational department. To a repetition of the request, Hall had replied, I have made so many promises and half-promises that it has been impossible to remember or to keep them. This disappointment hit me rather hard. I had in all only about 50 left, and could not remain away more than 9 weeks longer without getting into debt, I, who had calculated upon staying a whole year abroad. Circumstances over which I had no control later obliged me, however, to remain away almost another year, but that I could not foresee, and I had no means whatever to enable me to do so. Several of my acquaintances had had liberal allowances from the ministry. Krieger and Martensen had procured Hegard 225 at once, when he had been anxious to get away from Rasmus Nielsen's influence. It seemed to me that this refusal to give me anything augured badly for the appointment I was hoping for in Denmark. I could only earn a very little with my pen, about 11s, 3d, for 10 folio pages, and as I did not feel able, while traveling, to write anything of any value, I did not attempt it. It was with a sort of horror that, after preparing for long travels that were to get me out of the old folds, I thought of the earlier, narrow life I had led in Copenhagen. All the old folds seemed, at this distance, to have been the folds of a strait waistcoat. 35. With abominable slowness, and very late, on account of the war, the train crawled from Geneva southwards. Among the travelers was a rhetorical Italian master mason from Lyon, an old Garibaldist, the great event of whose life was that Garibaldi had once taken lunch alone with him at Versailles. He preserved in his home as a relic the glass from which the general had drunk. He was talkative and ready to help everyone. He gave us all food and drink from his provisions. Other travelers told that they had had to stand in queue for fully 12 hours in front of the ticket office in Paris to get away from the town. The train passed the place where Rousseau had lived, at Madame de Werne's. In an official work on Savoy, written by a priest, I had recently read a summary dismissal of Rousseau as a calumniator of his benefactress. According to this author, it certainly looked as though, to say the least of it, Rousseau's memory had failed him amazingly sometimes. The book asserted, for instance, that the Claude of whom he speaks was no longer alive at the time when he was supposed to be enjoying Madame de Werne's favors. We passed French volunteers in blouses bearing a red cross. They shouted and were in high good humor, past 10 districts, where numbers of Cretans, with their hideous excrescences, sat by the wayside. At last we arrived, several hours behind time, at St. Michel, at the foot of Mont Cenis. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I was beginning to feel tired, for I had been up since 4 in the morning. At 5 o'clock, we commenced the ascent, to the accompaniment of frightful groanings from the engine. All the travelers were crowded together in 3 wretched little carriages, the small engine not being able to pull more. Gay young French girls exulted at the idea of seeing Italy's fair skies. They were not particularly fair here. The weather was rough and cloudy, in keeping with abysms and mountain precipices. But late at night, the journey over Mont Cenis was wonderful. High up on the mountain, the moonlight gleamed on the mountain lake, and the way was dominated from one rocky summit by the castle of Brahmins with its 7 imposing forts. The locomotive stopped for an hour for want of water. We were thus obliged to sleep at the little Italian town of Susa in a glorious valley under Mont Cenis, the train to Turin having left 3 hours before. Susa was the first Italian town I saw. When the train came in next morning to the station at Turin, a crowd of Italian soldiers who were standing there shouted, "The Prussians forever," and winked at me. "What are they shouting for?" I asked a young Turin fellow with whom I had had some long conversations. "It is an ovation to you," he replied. "People are delighted at the victory of the Prussians, and they think you are a Prussian because of your fair mustache and beard." 36. An overwhelming impression was produced upon me by the monuments of Turin, the River Po, and the lovely gleaming in the streets. For the first time I saw colonnades, with heavy curtains to the street, serve as pavements, with balconies above them. Officers in uniforms gleaming with gold, ladies with handkerchiefs over their heads instead of hats, the mild warmth, the brown eyes, brought it home to me at every step that I was in a new country. I hurried up to Costanza Blanchetti. "Madame la Comtesse est à la campagne, Monsieur le Comte est sorti." Next morning, as I was sitting in my room in the Hotel Tremetta, Blanchetti rushed in, pressed me to his bosom, kissed me on both cheeks, would not let me go, but insisted on carrying me off with him to the country. We drove round the town first, then went by rail to Alpignano, where Costanza was staying with a relative of the family, Count Buglioni di Monil. Here I was received like a son, and shown straight to my room, where there stood a little bed with silk hangings, and where, on the pillow, there lay a little folded-up thing, likewise of white silk, which was an enigma to me till, on unfolding it, I found it was a nightcap, the classical nightcap, tapering to a point, which you see at the theatre in old comedies. Buglionis were gentle, good-natured people, rugged and yet refined, an old, aristocratic country gentleman and his wife. Nowhere have I thought grapes so heavy and sweet and aromatic as there. The perfume from the garden was so strong and fragrant, impossible to think of a book or a sheet of paper at Alpignano. We walked under the trees, lay among the flowers, enjoyed the sight and the flavor of the apricots and grapes, and chatted, expressing by smiles our mutual quiet, deep-reaching sympathy. One evening I went into Turin with Blanchetti to see the play. The lover in La Dame aux Camélias was played by a young Italian named Lavaghi, as handsome as an Antinous, a type which I often encountered in Piedmont. With his innate charm, restful calm, animation of movement, and the fire of his beauty, he surpassed the acting of all the young lovers I had seen on the boards of the French theatres. The very play of his fingers was all grace and expression. 37. On my journey from Turin to Milan, I had the mighty Monte Rosa with its powerful snow mass and the St. Bernard, over which Buonaparte led his tattered troops, before my eyes. We went across maize fields, through thickets, over the battlefield of Magenta. From reading Bayle, I had pictured Milan as a beautiful town, full of free delight in life. Only to see it would be happiness. And it was, the cupola gallery, the dome, from the roof of which, immediately after my arrival, I looked out over the town, shining under a pure, dark blue sky. In the evening, in the public gardens, I reveled in the beauty of the Milanese women. Italian ladies at that time still wore black lace over their heads instead of hats. Their dresses were open in front, the neck being bare halfway down the chest. I was struck by the feminine type. Upright, slender-waisted women, delicate, generally bare hands, oval faces, the eyebrows of an absolutely perfect regularity, narrow noses, well-formed, the nostrils curving slightly upwards and outwards, the models of Leonardo and Luini. The Last Supper, in the church of St. Maria del Grazie, and the drawings in the Ambrose Library brought me closer to Leonardo than I had ever been able to get before, through reproductions. I saw the true expression in the face of the Christ in the Last Supper, which copies cannot avoid distorting. 38. A violent affection for Correggio and a longing to see his works where they are to be found in greatest number sent me to Parma. I reached the town at night. No gas, no omnibus from any hotel. An outporter trotted with my portmanteau on his back through wide, pitch-dark, deserted, colonnaded streets, past huge palaces, until after half an hour's rapid walk, we arrived at the hotel. The day before my arrival, D'Alingaro had unveiled the beautiful and beautifully situated statue of Correggio in the market square. I first investigated the two domes in the cathedral and San Giovanni Evangelista, then the ingratiating pictorial decoration of the convent of San Paolo. In the museum, where I was pretty well the only visitor, I was so eagerly absorbed in studying Correggio and jotting down my impressions that in order to waste no time, I got the attendant to buy my lunch and devoured it, bread, cheese, and grapes, in the family's private apartments. They were pleasant, obliging people, and as I bought photographs for a considerable amount from them, they were very hospitable. They talked politics to me and made no secret of their burning hatred for France. There were other things to see at Parma besides Correggio, although for me he dominated the town. There was a large exhibition of modern Italian paintings and statuary and the life of the people in the town and round about. In the streets stood carts full of grapes. 4 or 5 fellows with bare feet would stamp on the grapes in one of these carts. A trough led from the cart down to a vat, into which the juice ran, flinging off old dirt in fermentation. It was pleasant to walk round the old ramparts of the town in the evening glow, and it was lively in the Ducal Park. One evening, little knots of Italian soldiers were sitting there. One of them sang in a superb voice, another accompanied him very nicely on the lute, the others listened with profound and eager attention. 39. After this came rich days in Florence. Everything was a delight to me there, from the granite paving of the streets to palaces, churches, galleries, and parks. I stood in reverence before the Medici monuments in Michelangelo's sanctuary. The people attracted me less. The women seemed to me to have no type at all, compared with the lovely faces and forms at Milan and Parma. The fleas attracted me least of all. D'Alingaro received every Sunday evening quite an international company, and conversation consequently dragged. With the charming Japanese wife of the English consul, who spoke only English and Japanese, neither of her hosts could exchange a word. There were Dutchmen and Swiss there with their ladies, sugar-sweet and utterly affected young Italian men, handsome young painters, and a few prominent Italian scientists, one of whom, in the future, was to become my friend. I had a double recommendation to the Danish minister at Florence, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and from an old and intimate friend of his in Copenhagen. When I presented my letters, he exclaimed in annoyance, "These special recommendations again! How often must I explain that they are unnecessary, that all Danes as such are welcome to my house?" This was the delicate manner in which he let me understand that he was not inclined to do anything whatever for me. Moreover, he began at once with regrets that his family were absent, so that he was not in housekeeping and could not entertain anyone. At a production of Émile Augier's La Fils de Gibeah, at which all the foreign diplomatists were present, he, too, turned up. While the other diplomatists greeted each other silently with a nod, he made more of the meeting than anyone else did, went from place to place in the stalls, shook hands, spoke French, German, English, and Italian by turns, was all things to all men, then came and sat down by me, made himself comfortable, and in a moment was fast asleep. When he began to snore, one after another of his colleagues turned their heads and smiled faintly. He slept through 2 acts and the intervals between them, in spite of the voices from the stage and the loud talking between the acts, and woke up in the middle of the 3rd act to mumble in my ear, "It is not much pleasure to see the piece played like this." At my favorite restaurant, Trattoria dell'Antiquaras, I was one day witness to a violent dispute between a Polish noble who, for political reasons, had fled from Russian Poland, and Hans Semper, a Prussian, author of a book on Donatello. The latter naturally worshipped Bismarck, the former warmly espoused the cause of Denmark. When I left, I said politely to him, "I thank you for having so warmly defended my country. I am a Dane." The next day the Pole came to look for me at the restaurant, and a closer acquaintance resulted. We went for many walks together along the riverside, he talking like a typical Polish patriot, I listening to his dreams of the resuscitated Poland that the future was to see. I mention this only because it affords an example of the remarkable coincidences life brings about, which make one so easily exclaim, "How small the world is." This Pole became engaged several years afterwards to a young Polish girl and left her, without any explanation, having got entangled with a Russian ballet dancer. I made her acquaintance at Warsaw 15 years after I had met him at Florence. She was then 26 years of age and is one of the women who have taught me most. She told me the story of her early youth and of the unengaging part my acquaintance of 1870 had played in it. At Florence I saw Rossi as Hamlet. The performance was a disappointment to me, inasmuch as Rossi, with his purely Italian nature, had done away with the essentially English element in Hamlet. The keen English humor in his hands became absurd and ridiculous. Hamlet's hesitation to act he overlooked altogether. Hamlet, to him, was a noble young man who was grieved at his mother's ill behavior. The details he acted like a virtuoso. For instance, it was very effective during the mimic play, when, lying at Ophelia's feet, he crushes her fan in his hands at the moment when the king turns pale. I derived my chief enjoyment not from the acting, but from the play. It suddenly revealed itself to me from other aspects, and I fell prostrate in such an exceeding admiration for Shakespeare that I felt I should never rise again. It was touching to hear the Italians' remarks on Hamlet. The piece was new to them. You frequently heard the observation, "It is a very philosophical piece." As people changed from place to place and sat wherever they liked, I overheard many different people's opinions of the drama. The suicide monologue affected these fresh and alert minds very powerfully. That evening, moreover, I had occasion to observe human cowardice, which is never accounted so great as it really is. There was a noise behind the scene during the performance, and immediately afterwards a shout of fuoco. The audience were overmastered by terror. More than half of them rushed to the doors, pulled each other down, and trampled on the fallen in their endeavors to get out quickly enough. Others rushed up on the stage itself. As there was not the least sign of fire visible, I of course remained in my seat. A few minutes later, one of the actors came forward and explained that there had been no fire. A fight between two of the scene-shifters had been the cause of all the alarm. The good-humored Italians did not even resent the fellows having thus disturbed and interrupted the performance. John Stuart Mill had given me an introduction to Pasquale Villari, who, even at that time, was commendator professor and held a high position on the Board of Education, but was still far from having attained the zenith of his fame and influence. When the reserve of the first few days had worn off, he was simply splendid to me. When anything I said struck him as being to the point, he pressed my hands with all the ardor of youth, and he applauded every joke I attempted with uproarious laughter. Some 20 years were to elapse before I saw him again. Then he called upon me in Copenhagen, wishing to make my acquaintance, without in the least suspecting that I was the young man who, so long before, had come to him from 1099. He looked with amazement at books, in which he had written with his own hand, and at old letters from himself, which I produced. I visited him again in 1898. His books on Machiavelli and Savonarola entitle him to rank among the foremost students and exponents of Italy. I went one day to the great annual fair at Fiesole. Shouting and shrieking, the people drove down the unspeakably dusty road with such haste, carelessness, and high spirits that conveyances struck against each other at every moment. It was the life represented in Marstrand's old-time pictures. In crowded Fiesole, I saw the regular Tuscan country type: brown eyes, yellow or clear, white skin, thin, longish face, brown or fair, but never black hair, strong, healthy bodies. The masculine type with which I was acquainted from the soldiers was undeniably handsomer than our own, in particular, was more intelligent. The young women were modest, reserved in their manner, seldom entered into conversation with the men, and despite the fire in their eyes, manifested a certain peasant bashfulness, which seems to be the same everywhere. 40 vines twine round the fruit trees. Black pigs and their families make their appearance in tribes. The lake of Thrasymene, near which Hannibal defeated the Romans, spreads itself out before us. The train is going from Florence to Rome. Towards midday a girl enters the carriage, apparently English or North American, with brown eyes and brown hair that curls naturally about her head. She has her guitar case in her hand and flings it up into the net. Her parents follow her. As there is room in the compartment for 48 persons without crowding, she arranges places for her parents, and after much laughter and joking the latter settle off to sleep. The Italians stare at her, but not one. I sit with my back to her. She sits down, back to back with me, then turns her head and asks me in Italian some question about time, place, or the like. I reply as best I can. She in English, "You are Italian?" On my reply, she tells me, "I hardly know 20 words in Italian. I only speak English, although I have been living in Rome for 2 years." She then went on to relate that she was an American, born of poor parents out on the Indian frontier. She was 26 years old, a sculptor, and was on her way from Carrara, where she had been superintending the shipment of one of her works, a statue of Lincoln, which the Congress at Washington had done her the honor of ordering from her. It was only when she was almost grown up that her talent had been discovered by an old sculptor who happened to pay a visit, and who, when he saw her drawing, had, half in jest, given her a lump of clay and said, "Do a portrait of me." She had then never seen a statue or a painting, but she evinced such talent that before long several distinguished men asked her to do busts of them, amongst others Lincoln. She was staying at his house that 14th April, 1865, when he was murdered, and was consequently selected to execute the monument after his death. She hesitated for a long time before giving up the modest, but certain, position she held at the time in a post office. But as others believed in her talent, she came to Europe, stayed first in Paris, where, to her delight, she made the acquaintance of Gustave Doré, and where she modeled a really excellent bust of Pierre Hyacinthe, visited London, Berlin, Munich, Florence, and settled down in Rome. There she received plenty of orders, had moreover obtained permission to execute a bust of Cardinal Antonelli, was already much looked up to, and well todo. In a few weeks she was returning to America. As she found pleasure in talking to me, she exclaimed without more ado, "I will stay with you," said a few polite things to me, and made me promise that I would travel with her to Rome from the place where we were obliged to leave the train, the railway having been broken up to prevent the Italian troops entering the Papal States. At Treni, a Danish couple got into the train, a mediocre artist and his wife, and with national astonishment and curiosity watched the evident intimacy between the young foreigner and myself, concerning which every Scandinavian in Rome was informed a few days later. From Monte Rotondo, where the bridge had been blown up, we had to walk a long distance over bad roads and were separated in the throng, but she kept a place for me by her side. Thus I drove for the first time over the Roman Campagna by moonlight, with 2 brown eyes gazing into mine. I felt as though I had met one of Sir Walter Scott's heroines and won her confidence at our first meeting. 41. Vinnie Ream was by no means a Scott heroine, however, but a genuine American, and doubly remarkable to me as being the first specimen of a young woman from the United States with whom I became acquainted. Even after I had seen a good deal of her work, I could not feel wholly attracted by her talent, which sometimes expressed itself rather in a pictorial than a plastic form, and had a fondness for emotional effects. But she was a true artist and a true woman, and I have never, in any woman, encountered a will like hers. She was uninterruptedly busy, although now that the time of her departure was so near, a few boxes were steadily being packed every day at her home. She received everyday visits from between 16 and 25 people, and she had so many letters by post that I often found 3 or 4 unopened ones amongst the visiting cards that had been left. Those were what she had forgotten, and if she had read them, she had no time to reply to them. Every day she sat for a few hours to the clever American painter Healy, who was an admirer of her talent and called her abilities genius. Every day she worked at Antonelli's bust. To obtain permission to execute it, she had merely, dressed in her most beautiful white gown, asked for an audience of the dreaded cardinal, and had at once obtained permission. Her intrepid manner had impressed the hated statesman of the political and ecclesiastical reaction, and in her representation of him he appeared, too, in many respects nobler and more refined than he was. But besides modeling the cardinal's bust, she put the finishing touches to 2 others, saw to her parents' household affairs and expenses, and found time every day to spend a few hours with me, either in a walk or wandering about the different picture galleries. She maintained the family, for her parents had nothing at all. But when the statue of Lincoln had been ordered from her, Congress had immediately advanced $10,000, so she was able to live free from care, though for that matter she troubled not at all about money. She was very ignorant of things outside her own field, and the words "my work" were the only ones that she spoke with passion. What she knew, she had acquired practically through travel and association with a multiplicity of people. She hardly knew a dozen words of any language besides English, and was only acquainted with English and American writers. Of poets, she knew Shakespeare and Byron best. From life and books, she had extracted but few general opinions, but on the other hand, very individual personal views. These were based upon the theory that the lesser mind must always subordinate itself to the higher, and that the higher has a right to utilize freely the time and strength of the lesser, without being called to account for doing so. She herself was abjectly modest towards the artists she looked up to. Other people might all wait, come again, go away without a reply. Rather small of stature, strong and healthy, she had never been ill, never taken medicine, with white teeth and red cheeks, quick in everything. When several people were present, she spoke only little and absently, was as cold, deliberate, and composed as a man of strong character. But at the same time she was unsuspecting and generous, and in spite of her restlessness and her ambitious industry, ingratiatingly coquettish towards anyone whose affection she wished to win. It was amusing to watch the manner in which she dispatched the dutifully sighing Italians who scarcely crossed the threshold of her studio before they declared themselves. She replied to them with a superabundance of sound sense and dismissed them with a jest. One day that I went to fetch her to the Casino Borghese, I found her dissolved in tears. One of the two beautiful doves who flew about the house and perched on her shoulders, and which she had brought with her from Washington, had disappeared in the night. At first I thought that her distress was half jest, but nothing could have been more real. She was beside herself with grief. I realized that if philologians have disputed as to how far Catullus' poem of the girl's grief over the dead sparrow were jest or earnest, it was because they had never seen a girl weep over a bird. Catullus, perhaps, makes fun a little of the grief, but the grief itself, in his poem too, is serious enough. In the lovely gardens of the Villa Borghese, Vinnie Ream's melancholy frame of mind was dispersed, and we sat for a long time by one of the handsome fountains and talked, among other things, of our pleasure in being together, which pleasure was not obscured by the prospect of approaching parting, because based only on good fellowship and with no erotic element about it. Later in the evening, she had forgotten her sorrow altogether in the feverish eagerness with which she worked, and she kept on, by candlelight, until 3 o'clock in the morning. A poor man, an Italian, who kept a little hotel, came in that evening for a few minutes. He sometimes translated letters for Vinnie Ream. As he had no business with me, I did not address any of my remarks to him. She, on the contrary, treated him with extreme kindness and the greatest respect, and whispered to me, "Talk nicely to him, as you would to a gentleman, for that he is. He knows 4 languages splendidly. He is a talented man. Take no notice of his plain dress. We Americans do not regard the position, but the man, and he does honor to his position." I had not been actuated by the prejudices she attributed to me, nevertheless entered into conversation with the man, as she wished, and listened with pleasure to his sensible opinions. He spoke, among other things, of northern art, and warmly praised Karl Bloch's Prometheus. 42. Vinnie Ream's opinion of me was that I was the most impolitic man that she had ever known. She meant by that I was always falling out with people. For instance, I had at once offended the Danes in Rome by some sharp words about the wretched Danish papers, and in general made fewer friends and more enemies all the time. She herself won the affection of everyone she wished, and made everyone ready to spring to do her bidding. She pointed out to me how politic she had had to be over her art. When she had wished to become a sculptor, everyone in her native place had been shocked at the unfemininity of it, and people fabled behind her back about her depraved instincts. She, for her part, exerted no more strength than just enough to carry her point, let people talk as much as they liked, took no revenge on those who spread calumnies about her, showed the greatest kindliness even towards the evil-disposed, and so, she said, had not an enemy. There was in her a marvelous commingling of determination to progress rapidly, of self-restraint, and of real good-heartedness. On October 20th, there was a great festival in Rome to celebrate the first monthly anniversary of the entry of the Italians into the town. Young men went in the evening with flags and music through the streets. Everybody rushed to the windows, and the ladies held out lamps and candles. In the time of the popes, this was only done when the host was being carried in solemn procession to the dying. It was regarded, therefore, as the greatest honor that could be paid. Everyone clapped hands and uttered shouts of delight at the improvised illumination, while the many beautiful women looked lovely in the flickering lamplight. The 23rd again was a gala day, being the anniversary of the death of Enrico Carolini of the celebrated brothers. He fell at Mentana, and I had promised Vinnie Ream to go to see the fete with her, but she as usual having 20 callers just when we ought to have started, we arrived too late. Vinnie begged of me to go with her instead to the American chapel. She must and would sing hymns, and really did sing them very well. The chapel was bare. On the walls, the 10 Commandments and a few other quotations from Holy Writ, and above a small altar, "Do this in remembrance of me," in Gothic lettering. I had to endure the hymns, the sermon awful, and the reading aloud of the 10 Commandments, with muttered protestations and amens after each one from the Reverend Americans. When we went out, I said nothing, as I did not know whether Vinnie might not be somewhat moved, for she sang at the end with great emotion. However, she merely took my arm and exclaimed, "That minister was the most stupid donkey I have ever heard in my life, but it is nice to sing." Then she began a refutation of the sermon, which had hinged chiefly on the words, "Thy sins are forgiven thee," and of the unspeakable delight it should be to hear this. Vinnie thought that no rational being would give a fig for forgiveness unless there followed with it a complete reinstatement of previous condition. What am I benefited if ever so many heavenly beings say to me, "I pretend you have not done it," if I know that I have? The last week in October we saw marvelous northern lights in Rome. The northern half of the heavens, about 9 o'clock in the evening, turned a flaming crimson, and white streaks traversed the red, against which the stars shone yellow, while every moment bluish flashes shot across the whole. When I discovered it, I went up to the Reims and fetched Vinnie down into the street to see it. It was an incredibly beautiful atmospheric phenomenon. Next evening it manifested itself again on a background of black clouds, and that was the last beautiful sight upon which Vinnie and I looked together. Next evening I wrote, "Vinnie Ream leaves tomorrow morning. I said goodbye to her this evening. Unfortunately, a great many people were there. She took my hand and said, 'I wish you everything good in the world, and I know that you wish me the same.' And then, goodbye. A door opens and a door closes, and people never meet again on this earth. Never again, never, and human language has never been able to discover any distinction between goodbye for an hour and goodbye forever. People sit and chat, smile and jest. Then you get up, and the story is finished. Over, over. And that is the end of all stories," says Anderson. "All one's life one quarrels with people as dear to one as Plaug is to me. I have a well-funded hope that I may see Rudolf Schmidt's profile again soon, and 100 times again after that. But Vinnie, I shall never see again." I did not understand her at first. I had a few unpleasant conjectures ready. I had to have many conversations with her before I understood her ingenuousness, her ignorance, her thorough goodness, in short, all her simple healthiness of soul. Over. When I was teasing her the other day about all the time I had wasted in her company, she replied, "People do not waste time with their friends," and when I exclaimed, "What do I get from you?" she answered, laughing, "Inspiration," and that was the truth. Those great brown eyes, the firm eyebrows, the ringleted mass of chestnut brown hair, and the fresh mouth, all this that I still remember, but perhaps in 3 months shall no longer be able to recall. The quick little figure, now commanding, now deprecating, is to me a kind of inspiration. I have never been in love with Vinnie, but most people would think so, to hear the expressions I am now using. But I love her as a friend, as a mind akin to my own. There were thoughts of our brains and strings of our hearts, which always beat in unison. Peace be with her. May the cursed world neither rend her nor devour her. May she die at last with the clear forehead she has now. I am grateful to her. She has communicated to me a something good and simple that one cannot see too much of, and that one scarcely ever sees at all. Finally, she has shown me again the spectacle of a human being entirely happy, and good because happy, a soul without a trace of bitterness, an intellect whose work is not a labor. It is not that Vinnie Iser rather was, since she is dead, for mean, educated girl in the Copenhagen sense of the word. The verdict of the Danish educational establishments upon her would be that she was a deplorably uneducated girl. She was incomprehensibly dull at languages. She would be childishly amused at a jest or joke or compliment as old as the hills, such as the Italians were fond of using, and think it new, for she knew nothing of the European storehouse of stereotyped remarks and salted drivel. Her own conversation was new. A breath of the independence of the great republic swept through it. She was no fine lady. She was an American girl who had not attained her rank by birth or through inherited riches, but had fought for it herself with a talent that had made its way to the surface without early training, through days and nights of industry and a mixture of enthusiasm and determination. She was vain, she certainly was that, but again like a child, delighted at verses in her honor in the American papers, pleased at homage and marks of distinction, but far more ambitious than vain of personal advantages. She laughed when we read in the papers of Vinnie Ream that, in spite of the ill-famed creative lady artists enjoy, far from being a monster with green eyes, she ventured to be beautiful. She was a good girl. There was a certain deep note about all that her heart uttered. She had a mind of many colors, and there was the very devil of a rush and forward march about her, always in a hurry. And no Roman elegy will hide her away in my memory. Here lies Vinnie Ream, sculptor of Washington, USA, 26 years of age. This recollection of her is retained by one who knew her for 17 days and will never forget her. I have really never seen Vinnie Ream since. We exchanged a few letters after her departure, and the rest was silence. Her statue of Abraham Lincoln stands now in a rotunda on the Capitol, for which it was ordered. Later, a Congress committee ordered from her a statue of Admiral Farragut, which is likewise erected in Washington. These are the only two statues that the government of the United States has ever ordered from a woman. Other statues of hers, which I have seen mentioned, bear the names of Miriam, the West, Sappho, the Spirit of Carnival, etc. Further than this, I only know that she married Richard 50, Hoxie, an engineer, and only a few years ago was living in Washington. 43. It was a real trouble to me that the Pope, in his exasperation over the conquest of Roman order, to make the accomplished revolution recoil also on the heads of the foreigners, whom he perhaps suspected of sympathy with the new order of things, had closed the Vatican and all its collections. Rome was to me first and foremost Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, Raphael's stanzas and loggias, and now all this magnificent array, which I had traveled so far to see, was closed to me by an old man's bad temper. But there was still enough to linger over in Rome. The two palaces that seemed to me most deserving of admiration were the Farnese and the Cancelleria, the former Michelangelo's, the latter Bramante's work, the first a perpetuation in stone of beauty and power, the second of grace and lightness. I felt that if one were to take a person with no idea of architecture and set him in front of these buildings, there would fall like scales from his eyes, and he would say, "Now I know what the building art means." Luini's exquisite painting, Vanity and Modesty, in the Galleria Sciarra, impressed me profoundly. It represented two women, one nun-like, the other magnificently dressed. The latter is Leonardo's well-known type, as a magically fascinating personality. Its essential feature is a profoundly serious melancholy, but the beauty of the figure is seductive. She is by no means smiling, and yet she looks as though a very slight alteration would produce a smile, and as though the heavens themselves would open, if smile, she 999. The powerful glance of the dark blue eyes is in harmony with the light brown hair and the lovely hands. It would be terrible to meet in real life a woman who looked like that, I wrote, for a man would grow desperate at his inability to win her, and desperate because the years must destroy such a marvel. That is why the gracious gods have willed it otherwise. That is why she does not exist. That is why she is only a vision, a revelation, a painting, and that is why she was conceived in the brain of Leonardo, the place on earth most favored by the gods, and executed by Luini, that all generations might gaze at her without jealousy and without dread of the molestations of time. One day at the Museo Kircheriano, where I was looking at the admirable antiquities, I made acquaintance with a Jesuit priest, who turned out to be exceedingly pleasant and refined, a very decent fellow, in fact. He spoke Latin to me and showed me round. At an inquiry of mine, he fetched from his quarters in the Collegio Romano a book with reproductions from the pagan section of the Lateran Museum, and explained to me some bas-reliefs which I had not understood. His obligingness touched me, his whole attitude made me think. Hitherto I had only spoken to one solitary embryo Jesuit, a young Englishman who was going to Rome to place himself at the service of the Pope, and who was actuated by the purest enthusiasm. I was struck by the fact that this second Jesuit, too, seemed to be a worthy man. It taught me how independent individual worth is of the nature of one's convictions. Most of the Italians I had so far been acquainted with were simple people, my landlord and his family, and those who visited them, and I sometimes heard fragments of conversation which revealed the common people's mode of thought to me. In one house that I visited, the mistress discovered that her maid was not married to her so-called husband, a matter in which, for that matter, she was very blameless, since her parents had refused their consent, and she had afterwards allowed herself to be abducted. Her mistress reproached her for the illegal relations existing. She replied, "If God wishes to plunge anyone into misery, that person is excused. We must not put the blame of everything upon God," said the mistress. "Yes, yes," replied the girl unabashed. "Then if the devil wishes to plunge a person into misery, the person is excused. Nor may we put the blame of our wrongdoing on the devil," said the mistress. "Good gracious," said the girl, "it must be the fault of one or other of them. Everybody knows that. If it is not the one, it is the other." At the house of the Blanchettis, who had come to Rome, I met many Turin and Roman gentlemen. They were all very much taken up by an old Sicilian chemist of the name of Muratori, who claimed that he had discovered a material which looked like linen, but was impervious to bullets, sword cuts, bayonet thrusts, etc. Blanchetti himself had fired his revolver at him at 2 paces, and the ball had fallen flat to the ground. There could be no question of juggling. Muratori was an honorable old Garibaldist who had been wounded in his youth, and now went about on crutches, but since we have never heard of its being made practical use of, it would seem that there was nothing in it. I did not care to look up all the Italians to whom I had introductions from Villari, but I tried my luck with a few of them. The first was Dr. Pantaloni, who had formerly been banished from the Papal States and who left the country as a radical politician, but now held almost conservative views. He had just come back and complained bitterly of all the licentiousness. "Alas," he said, "we have freedom enough now, but order, order." Pantaloni was a little, eager, animated man of 50, very much occupied, a politician and doctor, and he promised to introduce me to all the scholars whose interests I shared. As I felt scruples at taking up these gentlemen's time, he exclaimed wittily, "My dear fellow, take up their time. To take his time is the greatest service you can render to a Roman. He never knows what to do to kill it." The next man I went to was Prince Odescalchi, one of the men who had then recently risen to the surface, officially termed the hero of the young liberals. Pantaloni had dubbed him a blockhead, and he had not lied. He turned out to be a very conceited and frothy young man with a parting all over his head, fair to whiteness, of strikingly northern type, with exactly the same expressionless type of face as certain of the milksops closely connected with the court in Denmark. 44. There were a great many Scandinavians in Rome. They foregathered at the various eating houses and on a Saturday evening at the Scandinavian Club. Some of them were painters, sculptors, and architects. With their ladies, there were some literary and scientific men, and every description of tourists on longer or shorter visits to the Eternal City. I held myself aloof from them. Most of them had their good qualities, but they could not stand the test of any association which brought them into too close contact with one another, as life in a small town does. They were divided up into camps or hives, and in every hive ruled a lady who detested the queen bee of the next one. So it came about that the Scandinavians lived in perpetual squabbles, could not bear one another, slandered one another, intrigued against one another. When men got drunk on the good Roman wine at the ostery, they abused one another and very nearly came to blows. Moreover, they frequently got drunk, for most of them lost their self-control after a few glasses. Strangely enough, in the grand surroundings, too much of the northern pettiness came to the surface in them. One was continually tempted to call out to the ladies, in Holberg's words, "Hold your peace, you good women," and to the men, "Go away, you rapscallions, and make up your quarrels." There were splendid young fellows among the artists, but the painters, who were in the majority, readily admitted that technically they could learn nothing at all in Rome, where they never saw a modern painting. They said themselves that they ought to be in Paris, but the authorities in Christiania and Copenhagen were afraid of Paris. Thence all bad and dangerous influences proceeded, and so the painters still journey to Rome, as their fathers did before them. 45. Towards the middle of November the Pope opened the Vatican, but in face of the enormous conflux of people, it was not easy to get a permesso from the consul, and that could not be dispensed with. I had just made use of one for the Vatican sculpture collection one day when I felt very unwell. I ascribed my sensations at first to the insufferable weather of that month, alternately sirocco and cold sleet, or both at once. Then I was seized with a dread of the climate, of Rome, of all these strange surroundings, and I made up my mind to go home as quickly as possible. The illness that was upon me was, without my knowing it, the cause of my fear. The next day I was carried downstairs by two vile-smelling laborers and taken by Wilhelm Rosenstand the painter, who was one of the few who had made friends with me and shown me kindness, to the Prussian hospital on the Tarpeian Rock, near the capital. Here a bad attack of typhoid fever held me prisoner in my bed for some few months, after a compatriot, who had no connection whatever with me, had been so inconsiderate as to inform my parents by telegraph how ill I was, and that there was little hope for me. The first month I was not fully conscious. I suffered from a delusion of coercion. Thus it seemed to me that the left side of my bed did not belong to me, but to another man who sometimes took the place, and that I myself was divided into several persons, of which one, for instance, asked my legs to turn a little to the one side or the other. One of these persons was imperialist, and for that reason disliked by the others, who were republicans. Nevertheless, he performed great kindnesses for them, making them more comfortable when it was in his power. Another strangely fantastic idea that held sway for a long time was that on my head, the hair of which had been shorn by the hospital attendant rather less artistically than one cuts a dog's, there was a clasp of pearls and precious stones, which I felt but could not see. Afterwards, all my delusions centered on food. I was very much neglected at the hospital. The attendance was wretched. The highly respected German doctor, who was appointed to the place, had himself an immense practice, and moreover was absolutely taken up by the Franco-Prussian War. Consequently, he hardly ever came, sometimes stayed away as long as 13 days at a stretch, during all which time a patient who might happen to be suffering, say from constipation, must lie there without any means of relief. My bed was as hard as a stone, and I was waked in the night by pains in my body and limbs. The pillow was so hard that the skin of my right ear was rubbed off from the pressure. There were no nurses. There was only one custodian for the whole hospital, a Russian fellow who spoke German, and who sometimes had as many as 14 patients at a time to look after, but frequently went out to buy stores or visit his sweetheart, and then all the patients could ring at once without anyone coming. After I had passed the crisis of my illness and consequently began to suffer terribly from hunger, I was ordered an egg for my breakfast. I sometimes had to lie for an hour and a half, pining for this egg. Once, for 3 days in succession, there were no fresh eggs to be had. So he would bring for my breakfast nothing but a small piece of dry bread. One day that I was positively ill with hunger, I begged repeatedly for another piece of bread, but he refused it me. It was not malice on his part, but pure stupidity, for he was absolutely incapable of understanding how I felt. And to save fuel, he let me suffer from cold, as well as from hunger, would never put more than one wretched little stick at a time into the stove. Everything was pinched to an incredible extent. Thus it was impossible for me to get a candle in the evening before it was absolutely dark, and then never more than one, although it made my eyes water to try to read. Candles and firing, it appears, were not put down in the bill. And yet this hospital is kept up on subscriptions from all the great powers, so there must be someone into whose pockets the money goes. Most of us survived it. A few died who possibly might have been kept alive. One was preserved, for whom the Danish newspapers have beautiful obituaries ready. Over my head, in the same building, there lived a well-known German archaeologist, who was married to a Russian princess of such colossal physical proportions that Roman popular wits asserted that, when she wished to go for a drive, she had to divide herself between 2 cabs. This lady had a great talent for music. I never saw her, but I became aware of her in more ways than one. Whenever she crossed the floor on the third story, the ceiling shook, and the boards creaked, in a manner unbearable to an invalid. And just when I had settled myself off, and badly wanted to sleep, towards 11 o'clock at night, the heavy lady above would sit down at her grand piano, and make music that would have filled a concert hall resound through the place. After a month had passed, the doctor declared that I had turned the corner, and might begin to take a little food besides the broth that up till then had been my only nourishment. A little later, I was allowed to try to get up. I was so weak that I had to begin to learn to walk again. I could not support myself on my legs, but dragged myself, with the help of the custodian, the 4 or 5 steps from the bed to a sofa. Just at this time, I received 2 letters from Copenhagen, containing literary inquiries and offers. The first was from the editor of the Illustrated Times, and inquired whether on my return home I would resume the theatrical criticisms in the paper. In that case, they would keep the position open for me. I gave a negative reply, as I was tired of giving my opinion on a Danish drama. The second letter, which surprised me more, was from the editor of the, at that time, powerful daily paper, Steen Bill, offering me the entire management of the paper after the retirement of Malbec, except so far as politics were concerned, the editor naturally himself retaining the latter. As Danish things go, it was a very important offer to a young man. It promised both influence and income, and it was only my profound and ever-increasing determination not to give myself up to journalism that made me without hesitation dictate a polite refusal. I was still too weak to write. My motive was simply and solely that I wished to devote my life to knowledge. But Bill, who knew what power in a little country like Denmark his offer would have placed in my hands, hardly understood it in this way, and was exceedingly annoyed at my refusal. It gave the first impulse to his altered feeling toward me. I have sometimes wondered since whether my fate in Denmark might not have been different had I accepted the charge. It is true that the divergence between what the paper and I, in the course of the great year 1871, came to represent, would soon have brought about a split. The Commune in Paris caused a complete volte-face of the liberal bourgeoisie in Denmark, as elsewhere. 46. While I was still too weak to write, I received a letter from Henrik Ibsen dated December 20, 1870, which impressed me greatly. Henrik Ibsen and I had been on friendly terms with one another since April 1866, but it was only about this time that our intimacy began to emit sparks, an intimacy which was destined to have a very widening influence upon me, and which is perhaps not without traces on the stages of his poetical progress. Ibsen thought I had already recovered, and wrote to me as to a convalescent. He complained bitterly of the conquest of Rome by the Italians. Rome was now taken from us men and given over to the politicians. It had been a spot sacred to peace, and was so no longer. This assertion was at variance with my religion. It seemed to me unpermissible to desire, for aesthetic reasons, to see the restoration of an ecclesiastical regime, with its remorseless system of oppression. Human happiness and intellectual progress were worth more than the retention of the idols of naivete. I replied to him by declaring my faith in freedom, and soon he outdid me in this, as in other domains. But there was one other part of the letter that went to my heart and rejoiced me. It was where Ibsen wrote that what was wanted was a revolt in the human mind, and in that I ought to be one of the leaders. These words, which were in exact agreement with my own secret hope, fired my imagination, ill though I was. It seemed to me that after having felt myself isolated so long, I had at last met with the mind that understood me and felt as I did, a real fellow-fighter. As soon as I was once more fit to use my pen, I wrote a flaming reply in verse headed, "The Hospital in Rome, the night of January 9, 1871. In it I described how solitary I had been in my intellectual fight and endeavor, and expressed my contentment at having found a brother in him. 47. Among the Danes, and there were not many of them, who frequently came to see me at the hospital, I must mention the kind and tactful musician Niels Ravenkelder, whom I had known when I was a child. He had been living in Rome now for some 20 years. He was gentle and quiet, good-looking, short of stature, modest and unpretending, too weak of character not to be friends with everyone, but equipped with a natural dignity. When a young music master in Copenhagen, He had fallen in love with a young, wealthy girl, whose affections he succeeded in winning in return, but he was turned out of the house by her harsh, purse-proud father, and in desperation had left Denmark to settle down in Rome. As his ladylove married soon after and became a contented wife and mother, he remained where he was. He succeeded in making his way. He gradually became a favorite teacher of music among the ladies of the Roman aristocracy, who sometimes invited him to their country houses in the summer. He was on a good footing with the native maestros most in request, who quickly understood that the modest Dane was no dangerous rival. Graceful as Ravenskulde was in his person, so he was in his art. There was nothing grand about him, but he was clever and had a natural, unaffected wit. His difficult position as a master had taught him prudence and reserve. He was obligingness personified to traveling Scandinavians, and was proud of having, as he thought, made the acquaintance in Rome of the flower of the good society of the northern countries. Even long after he had come to the front, he continued to live in the fourth-story apartment of the Via Ripetta, where he had taken up his abode on his arrival in Rome, waited upon by the same simple couple. His circumstances could not improve, if only for the reason that he sent what he had to spare to relatives of his in Copenhagen, who had a son who was turning out badly, and lived by wasting poor Ravenskulde's savings. After having been the providence of all Danish travelers to Rome for 30 years, certain individuals who had influence with the government succeeded in obtaining a distinction for him. The government then gave him, not even the poor little decoration that he ought to have had 20 years before, but brilliant idea, awarded him the title of professor, which in Italian, of course, he had always been, and which was a much more insignificant title than maestro, by which he was regularly called. Ravenskulde wrote my letters at the hospital for me, and the day I came out, we drove away together to the French restaurant to celebrate the occasion by a dinner. I went from there up to Monte Pincio in a glorious sunshine, rejoiced to see the trees again, and the people in their Sunday finery, and the lovely women's faces, as well as at being able to talk to people once more. It was all like new life in a new world. I met a good many Scandinavians, who congratulated me, and a young savant, Giuseppe Cerdo, who, as professor of law, had been removed from Siena to Rome, and with whom, at the house of D'Alingaro at Florence, I had had some delightful talks. We decided that we would keep in touch with one another. 48. It was only this one day, however, that happiness and the sun shone upon me. On the morrow, pains in my right leg, in which there was a vein swollen, made me feel very unwell. So ignorant was the doctor that he declared this to be of no importance, and gave me a little ointment with which to rub my leg. But I grew worse from day to day, and after a very short time my leg was like a lump of lead. I was stretched once more for some months on a sickbed, and this weakened me the more since very heroic measures were used in the treatment of the complaint, a violent attack of phlebitis. The leg was rubbed every day from the sole of the foot to the hip with mercury ointment, which could not be without its effect on my general health. Still, I kept up my spirits finely. Among the Scandinavians who showed me kindness at this time, I gratefully remember the Danish painters Rosenstand and Mackaprang, who visited me regularly and patiently, and my friend Walter Runeberg, the Finnish sculptor, whose cheerfulness did me good. Other Scandinavians with whom I was less well acquainted came to see me now and again, but they had one very annoying habit. It was customary at that time for all letters to be addressed, for greater security, to the Danish consulate, which served the purpose of a general Scandinavian consulate. Anyone who thought of coming to see me would fetch what letters had arrived for me that day and put them in his pocket to bring me. The letters I ought to have had at 10 o'clock in the morning, I generally received at 7 in the evening. But these gentlemen often forgot to pay their visit at all, or did not get time, and then it would happen that after having gone about with the letters in their pockets for a few days, they took them back to the consulate, whence they were sent to me once 3 days late. As my whole life on my sickbed was one constant, painful longing for letters from home, the more so as my mother, all the time I was in bed, was lying dangerously ill, I felt vexed at the thoughtless behavior of my compatriots. However, I had not traveled so far to meet Northmen, and I learnt far more from the one Italian who sat by my bedside day after day, Giuseppe Cerdo. It was amusing to note the difference between his ways and the Northmen's. He did not come in, he exploded. At 6 o'clock in the evening, He would rush in without knocking at the door, shouting at one and the same time Italian to the people of the house and French to me. He talked at a furious rate, and so loudly that people who did not know might have fancied we were quarreling, and he changed his seat once a minute, jumped up from the easy chair and seated himself half in the window, began a sentence there, and finished it sitting on my bed. And every second or third day he either himself brought books to entertain me or sent large parcels by a messenger. He had risen to be professor at the University of the capital without ever having been either student or graduate. His family were too poor for him to study. For many years, when a lad, he had never eaten dinner. His occupation, when at last he began to get on, was that of proofreader in a printing establishment, but he tried to add to his income by writing melodramas for the boulevard theaters in Turin. He thought he had written over 50. He told me. The manager generally came to me on a Sunday when we were at liberty and said, "We must have a new play for next Sunday." On Monday the first act was finished, on Tuesday the second, etc. And every act was delivered as it was written and the parts allotted. Sometimes the last act was only finished on Saturday morning, which, however, would not prevent the piece being played on Sunday evening. In a number of the Revue des Deux Mondes for 1857, we found Cerdo mentioned among the melodramatists of Italy. This must have been ferreted out privately, since he always wrote these melodramas anonymously, he having determined, with naive conceit, not to stain his future reputation. When he was 21, he tried to raise himself from this rank to that of a journalist, and succeeded. He sent all sorts of articles to 3 newspapers. From his 21st to his 25th year, he wrote for the daily papers, and wrote gay accounts of the volatile lives of young Italian journalists with the ladies of the theaters. Then he fell in love with the lady who later became his wife, known as a novelist under the pseudonym of Ludovico de Rosa, and from that time forth never looked at another woman. All his life he cherished a great admiration for his wife and gratitude towards her. When he had commenced his legal work, he strained every nerve to the utmost and obtained his professorships in the various towns through competition, without having followed the usual university path. "I have always had the most unshaken faith in my star," he said one day, even when, from hunger or despair, thoughts of suicide occurred to me. "When I broke my black bread, I said to myself, 'The day will come when I shall eat white.'" Like all Italians at that time, Cerdo detested and despised modern France. As far as reconquered Rome was concerned, he regarded her with sorrowful eyes. "There are only nobility, ecclesiastics, and workmen here," he said, "no middle classes, no industry, and no trade. Absurd tariff laws have up till now shut off the papal states from the surrounding world. And what a government! A doctor, who after his second visit did not make his patient confess to a priest, lost his official post, if he happened to hold one, and was in any case sent to prison for 5 months. A doctor who did not go to Mass a certain number of times during the week was prohibited practicing. The huge number of tied-up estates made buying and selling very difficult. The new government has struck the nobility a fatal blow by abolishing entailed property and lands. The calling in of the ecclesiastical property by the state is giving the towns a chance to breathe. Whenever I revisited Italy, I saw Cerdo. His heroism during the inquiries into the irregularities in Naples in 19,001,901 made his name beloved and himself admired in his native country. He died in 1902, the highest life official in Italy. Since 1897, he had been president of the council. 49. I came under an even greater debt of gratitude than to Cerdo, to the good-natured people in whose house I lay 99. I was as splendidly looked after as if I had made it a specified condition that I should be nursed in case of illness. My landlady, Maria especially, was the most careful nurse and the best creature in the world, although she had the physiognomy of a regular Italian criminal when her face was in repose. The moment she spoke, however, her features beamed with maternal benevolence. After the hospital, it was a decided change for the better. I was under no one's tyranny and did not feel as though I were in prison. I could complain if my food was bad and change trattoria when I myself chose. Everything was good. As long as I was well, I had taken hardly any notice of the people in the house, hardly exchanged a word with them. I was out all day, and either hastily asked them to do my room or to put a little on the fire. It was only when I fell ill that I made their acquaintance. Let me quote from my notes at the time. Maria is 40 but looks nearly 60. Her husband is a joiner, a stout, good-looking man who works all day for his living and has a shop. Then there is Maria's niece, the 19-year-old Philomena, a tall, handsome girl. Every evening they have fine times, laugh, sing, and play cards. On Sunday evening, they go out to the fair alla fiera and look at the things without buying. Others have to pay a lyre to go in, but they go in free, as they know some of the people. On festival occasions, Maria wears a silk dress. There is a crucifix over my bed, an oleograph of the Madonna and Child and a heart, embroidered with gold on white, horribly pierced by the 7 swords of pain, which were supposed to be nails. On the center of the heart, you read, partly in Latin, partly in Greek letters, Jesu expiae passio. All the same, Maria is very skeptical. Yesterday, on the evening of my birthday, we had the following conversation. Myself, here you celebrate your saint's day, not your birthday. But you know, up in the north we have not any saints and, thinking it necessary to add a deep-drawn religious sigh, I continued, we think it enough to believe in God. Oh yes, she said slowly, and then, a little while after, that too is his own business. How? Well, she said, you know that I am dreadfully ignorant. I know nothing at all, but I think a great deal. There are these people now who are always talking about the Lord. I think it is all stuff. When I married, they said to me, may it please the Lord that your husband be good to you. I thought, if I had not been sensible enough to choose a good husband, it would not help me much what should please the Lord. Later on they said, may it please the Lord to give you sons. I had some, but they died when they were little ones. Then I thought to myself, if my husband and I do not do something in the matter, it will not be much use for the Lord to be pleased to give them to us. Nature, too, has something to say to it. Ancilla natura e una piccola cosa. You have no idea, sir, how we have suffered from priests here in the papal state. Everyone had to go to confession, and as of course they did not wish to confess their own sins, they confessed other people's, and told lies, too, and in that way the priests knew everything. If the priest had heard anything about a person, he or she would get a little ticket from him, come to me at such and such a time. Then when the person went, he would say, are you mad to live with such and such a person without being married? And all the while he himself had a woman and a nest full of children. Then he would say, I will not have you in my parish, and he would publish the poor thing's secret to the whole world. Or if he were more exasperated, he would say, out of the Pope's country, and send for a few carabineers. They would take one to a cart and drive one to the frontier. There were fresh carabineers who took one farther, and all without trial or any inquiry. Often the accusation was false, but we were ruled by spies, and all their power was based on the confessional, which is nothing but spying. Shortly before Easter, a priest came and counted how many there were in the house. If afterwards there were one who did not go to Mass, then his name was stuck up on the church door as an infidel in disgrace. It is many years now since I have been to any confessor. When I die, I shall say, God, forgive me my sins and my mistakes, and shall die in peace without any priest. Whatever we talk about, Maria always comes back to her hatred of the priests. The other day, we were speaking of the annoyance I had been subjected to by a compatriot of mine, KB, who came to see me, but looked more particularly at a large fiasco I had standing there, containing 4 bottles of Chianti. He tasted the wine, which was very inferior, declared it nice, and began to drink 10 glasses straight off. At first he was very polite to me, and explained that it was impossible to spend a morning in a more delightful manner than by visiting the Sistine Chapel first, and me in my sick room afterwards, but by degrees he became ruder and ruder, and as his drunkenness increased I sank in his estimation. At last he told me that I was intolerably conceited, and started abusing me thoroughly. Lying defenseless in bed and unable to move, I was obliged to ring for Maria, and whisper to her to fetch a few gentlemen from the Scandinavian Club, who could take the drunken man home after he had wasted fully 6 hours of my day. I managed in this way to get him out of the door. He was hardly gone than Maria burst out, "Chi porcheria," and then added laughing to show me her knowledge of languages, cachonery, schweinerei. She has a remarkable memory for the words she has heard foreigners use. She knows a number of French words, which she pronounces half like Italian, and she also knows a little Russian and a little German, having, when a young girl, kept house for a Russian prince and his family. I feel, she said to me, that I could have learnt both French and German easily if I could have compared them in a book. But I can neither read nor write. These wretched priests have kept us in ignorance, and now I am old and good for nothing. I was 40 a little while ago, and that is too old to learn the alphabet. Do you know, Signor, how it originally came about that I did not believe and despised the priests? I was 12 years old, and a tall girl, and a very good-looking girl too, though you cannot see that, now that I am old and ugly. You can see it very plainly, for her features are haughty and perfectly pure of line. It is only that her expression, when she sits alone, is sinister. I lost my father when I was 5 years old. About that time my mother married again, and did not trouble herself any more about me, as she had children with her new husband. So I was left to myself, and ran about the streets, and became absolutely ungovernable from vivacity, life, and mischief, for I was naturally a very lively child. Then one day I met a mule, alone. The man had left it. I climbed up and seated myself upon it and rode about up and down the street until a dog came that frightened the mule, and it kicked and threw me over its head. There I lay with a broken collarbone, and some of the bone stuck out through the skin. Then a doctor came and wanted to bind it up for me, but I was ashamed for him to see my breast, and would not let him. He said, "Rubbish, I have seen plenty of girls." So I was bound up, and for 6 weeks had to lie quite still. In the meantime a priest, whom they all called Don Carlo, I do not know why they said Don, came to see me, and when I was a little better, and only could not move my left arm, he said to me one day, would I go and weed in his garden, and he would give me money for it. So I went every day into the garden, where I could very well do the work with one arm. He came down to me, brought me sweets and other things, and asked me to be his friend. I pretended not to understand. He said, too, how pretty I was and such things. Then at last one day he called me into his bedroom and first gave me sweets, and then set me on his knee. I did not know how to get away. Then I said to him, "It is wrong, the Madonna would not like it." Do you know, sir, what he replied? He said, "Child, there is no Madonna, non si è Madonna, she is only a bridal for the common people e un freno per il populo basso." Then I was anxious to run away, and just then my mother passed by the garden, and as she did not see me there, called, "Anna Maria." "Anna Maria," I said, "Mother is calling me," and ran out of the room. Then mother said to me, "What did the priest say to you, and what did he do to you? You were in his bedroom." I said nothing, but when my mother went to confession, instead of confessing her sins, she said over and over again to him, "What have you done to my daughter? I will have my daughter examined to see what sort of a man you are." He declared, "I will have you shot if you do una buona schiappata." So mother did not dare to go farther in the matter, but she would not believe me. Here we were interrupted by the Russian woman from next door coming in. She is married, more or less, to a waiter, and she complained of his volatility and cried with jealousy. "Once I was just as weak," said Maria. "When I was newly married, I was so jealous of my husband that I could neither eat nor drink if anyone came to me and said, 'This evening he is with such and such a one.' If I tried to eat, I was sick at once. I am just as fond of him as I was then, but I am cured now. If I saw his infidelity with my own eyes, I should not feel the least bit hurt about it. Then I could have strangled him." Philomena. Italian landladies, the carnival, the Macaulay feast, Philomena's views. Philomena sings lustily from early morning till late at night, and her name suits her. The Greek Philomela has acquired this popular form, and in use is often shortened to Philome. The other day I made her a present of a bag of English biscuits. Her face beamed, as I have never besides seen anything beam, but the face of my cafetiere is a boy of 12 now, and again he gets a few soldi for bringing me my coffee or tea. Anyone who has only seen the lighting up of northern faces has no conception, as even painters admit, of such transfiguration. Yes, indeed, Philomena's tall figure and fresh mountain blood would freshen up the Goldschmidtchen human race to such an extent that they would become better men and women in his next books. I have seen a little of the carnival. This morning Philomena came to my room to fetch a large Italian flag which belongs there. "I am going to wave it on Thursday," she said, and added with blushing cheeks, "Then I shall have a mask on." But this evening she could not restrain herself. For the first time during the 5 months I have lived here, and for the first time during the month I have been ill, she came in without my having called or rung for her. She had a red silk cap on, with a gold border. "What do you say to that, sir?" she said, and her clear laughter rang through the room. It revived my sick self to gaze at ease at so much youth, strength, and happiness. Then I said a few kind words to her, and encouraged by them, she burst into a stream of eloquence about all the enjoyment she was promising herself. This would be the first carnival she had seen. She came from the mountains and was going back there this spring. She was in the seventh heaven over her cap. She always reminds me, with her powerful frame, of the young giantess in the fairy tale who takes up a peasant and his plough in the hollow of her hand. Philomena is as tall as a moderately tall man, slenderly built, but with broad shoulders. She impresses one as enjoying life thoroughly. She has herself made all she wears a poor little grey woolen skirt with an edging of the Italian colors, which has been lengthened some 9 inches at the top by letting in a piece of shirting. A thin redanned black-striped jacket that she wears, a kind of loose Garibaldi, is supposed to hide this addition, which it only very imperfectly does. Her head is small and piquant, her hair heavy, blue-black, her eyes light brown, of exquisite shape, smiling and kind. She has small, red lips and the most beautiful teeth that I remember seeing. Her complexion is brown, unless she blushes, then it grows darker brown. Her figure is unusually beautiful, but her movements are heavy, so that one sees at once she is quite uneducated. Still, she has a shrug of the shoulders, ways of turning and twisting her pretty head about that are absolutely charming. I have sent Philomena into the town to buy a pound of figs for me and one for herself. While she is away, I reflect that I cannot sufficiently congratulate myself on my excellent landlady and the others. As a rule, these Roman lodging-house keepers are, judging by what one hears, perfect bandits. When the Norwegian sculptor, lay dangerously ill, the woman in whose house he was did not even speak to him. She went out and left him alone in the house. When the Danish dilettante was at death's door, his landlady did not enter his room once a day or give him a drink of water, and he was obliged to keep a servant. 5's landlady stole an opera glass, a frock coat, and a great deal of money from him. Most foreigners are swindled in 100 different ways. If they make a stain on the carpet, they must pay for a new one. Maria looks after me like a mother. Every morning she rubs me with the ointment the doctor has prescribed. When I have to have a bath, she takes me in her arms, without any false shame, and puts me in the water, then takes me up and puts me to bed again. After my sojourn in the hospital, I am not very heavy. What I am most astonished at is the indulgent delicacy of these people. For instance, Maria has forbidden her good-natured husband, whom, like Philomena, I like to call Zio uncle, to eat garlic, the favorite food of the Romans, while I am ill, that I may not be annoyed in my room by the smell. I have only to say a word, and she and her niece run all my errands for me. Indeed, the other day Maria exclaimed, quite indignantly, "Sir, do not say when you go into the town, will you buy me this or that? Are we robbers? Are we scoundrels? Only say go, and I will go." I never say to her, "Will you do me a favor?" without her replying, "Too, sir." Yes, and she heaps presents upon me. She and Philomena bring me, now a bundle of firewood, now a glass of good wine, now macaroni, etc. All the Danes who come here are astonished, and say, "You have got deucedly good people to look after you." Maria's greatest pleasure is talking. She has no time for it in the day. In the evening, however, she tidies my room slowly, entertaining me all the time. When she has quite finished, at the time of day when others are drowsy or go to bed, she still likes to have just a little more conversation, and she knows that when I see she has put the last thing into its place, her task for the day is ended, and I shall dismiss her with a gracious buona sera, bon riposo. To put off this moment as long as possible, she will continue to hold some object in her hand, and standing in the favorite position of the Romans, with her arms akimbo and some toilet article under her arm, will hold a long discourse. She sometimes looks so indescribably comic that I almost choke with suppressed laughter as we talk. Today is the first day of the carnival, so even Philomena has been out this evening in tricolored trousers. I am interrupted by the inmates of all the floors returning from the carnival, all talking at once, and coming straight in to me to show me their dress. Amongst them from the carnival, all talking at once, and coming straight in to me to show me their dress. Amongst them are guests from the mountains, tall, dark men, in exceedingly fantastic garb. They tell me how much they have enjoyed themselves. Philomena has naively made me a present of a few burnt almonds with sugar upon them, that she has had in her trouser pockets, and informs me with impetuous volubility how she has talked to all the people she met. who do not know her and whom she does not know. She has had one of my white shirts on, which she had embroidered all over with ribbons till it looked like a real costume. She is beaming with happiness. The tambourine tinkles all the evening in the street. They are dancing the tarantella to it down below, and it is difficult to go to sleep. Maria stays behind when the others have gone to finish her day's work. It is a sight for the gods to see her doing it with a gold brocade cap on her head and in red, white, and green trousers. None of them guess what a torment it is to me to lie and hear about the carnival, which is going on a few streets from where I am lying, but which I cannot see. When shall I spend a winter in Rome again? No other carnival will be to compare with this one after the Romans for 10 years have held altogether aloof from it, and one hardly even on Marcoli Eve saw more than 2 carriages full of silly Americans pelting one another with confetti, while the porters and the French soldiers flung gibes and dirt at each other. Now Rome is free, jubilation breaks out at all the pores of the town, and I, although I am in Rome, must be content to see the reflection of the festival in a few ingenuous faces. It is morning, I have slept well and am enjoying the fresh air through the open windows. Heavens, what a lovely girl is standing on the balcony nearly opposite in a chemise and skirt. I have never seen her there before. Olive complexion, blue-black hair, the most beautiful creature. I cannot see her features distinctly. Now they are throwing something across to her from the house next door to us on a piece of twine. I think they are red flowers. They almost touch her, and yet she cannot catch them, and laughing stretches out both hands a second, a third and fourth time, equally unsuccessfully. Why, it is our Philomena, visiting the model the other side the street. She gives up the attempt with a little grimace and goes in. Loud voices are singing the Bersagliere hymn as a duet under my window. Verily, things are alive in Purificazione today. The contagion of example affects a choir of little boys who are always lying outside the street door, and they begin to sing the Garibaldi March for all they are worth. Our singers at the theater at home would be glad of such voices. The whole street is ringing now. All are singing one of Verdi's melodies. I am sitting up in bed. At the side of my bed, Philomena, with her black, heavy hair well dressed, and herself in a kind of transitional toilette, her undergarment fine, the skirt that of a festival gown, on account of the preparations for the carnival, her top garment the usual red jacket. She is standing with her hand on her hip, but this does not make her look martial or alarming. "Are you ate magro today? It was a fast day." "She good gracious, magro every day just now." "I do you know, Philomena, that I eat grasso." "She yes, and it is your duty to do so." "I why?" "She because you are ill, and you must eat meat. The Pope himself ate meat when he was 99. Religion does not mean that we are to injure our health." "I how do you know, Philomena, what religion means?" "She from my confessor. I had a little headache the other day, and he ordered me at once to eat meat." "I the worst of it is that I have no confessor and do not go to church. Shall I be damned for that?" "She oh no, sir, that does not follow. Do you think I am so stupid as not to see that you others are far better Christians than we? You are good. The friends who come to see you are good. The Romans, on the other hand, who go to church one day, kill people the next, and will not let go about the streets in peace. I am quite sorry that she is to go home at Easter. I shall miss her face about the house, but I have missed more. Late evening, they have come back from the carnival. Philomena came in and presented me with an object the use of which is an enigma to me, a roll of silver paper. Now I see what it is, a carnival cap. My Danish friend R declares she has got it into her head that when I am better I shall marry her, or rather that Maria has put it into her head. I thought I would see how matters stood. I began talking to Maria about marriages with foreigners. Maria mentioned how many girls from Rome and Capri had married foreigners, but added afterwards, not without significance, addressing me, "It is not, as you believe, and as you said once before, that a girl born in a warm country would complain of being taken to a cold one. If she did, she would be stupid. But a Roman girl will not do for a foreign gentleman. The Roman girls learn too little. Much the lower classes certainly do not learn. Before I came, Philomena did not know what ink was. Now I have discovered that she does not know what a watch is. She reckons time by the dinner and the Ave Maria. Not long ago her uncle spent a week in trying to teach this great child to make and read figures, but without success. Not long ago she had to write to her mother in the mountains, so went to a public writer and had it done for her. She came in to me very innocently afterwards to know whether the right name and address were upon it. I told her that she could very well have let me write the letter. Since then, all the people in the house come to me when there is anything they want written and ask me to do it for them. The news of my skill has spread. Apropos of letters, I have just read the 4 letters that I received today. Philomena is perpetually complaining of my sweetheart's uncontrollable passion as revealed in this writing madness. She imagines that all the letters I receive from Denmark are from one person, and that person, of course, a woman. She herself hardly receives 1 letter a year. I have after careful consideration committed a great imprudence and escaped without hurt. I had myself carried down the stairs, drove to the Corso, saw the carnival, and am back home again. I had thought first of driving up and down the Corso in a carriage, but did not care to be wholly smothered with confetti, especially as I had not the strength to pelt back. Nor could I afford to have the horses and carriage decorated, so I had a good seat in a first-floor balcony engaged for me, first row. At 3 o'clock I got up, dressed, and was carried down. I was much struck by the mild summer air out of doors, about the same as our late May, and I enjoyed meeting the masked people in the streets we passed through. The few, but rather steep stairs up to the balcony were a difficulty. But at last I was seated, and in spite of sickness and weakness, enjoyed the carnival in Rome on its most brilliant day. I was sitting nearly opposite to the high box of Princess Margarita, from which there was not nearly so good a view as from my seat. This was what I saw, all the balconies bedecked with flags, red, white, and green predominating. In the long, straight street, the crowd moving in a tight mass. In between them, an up and a down stream of carriages, drawn at a walking pace by 2 horses and forced at every moment to stop. The streets reached with the jingle of the horses' bells and with shouts of glee at a magnificently decorated carriage, then at some unusually beautiful women, then at a brisk confetti fight between 2 carriages or a carriage and a balcony. And this air, reaching with the ring of bells, with shouting and with laughter, was no empty space. Anyone reaching the Corso, as I had done, after the play had only been going on for an hour and a half, found themselves in the midst of a positive bombardment of tiny little aniseed balls, or of larger plaster balls thrown by hand from little tin cornets or half-bushel measures, and against which it is necessary to protect oneself by a steel wire mask before the face. For while some gentle young ladies almost pour the confetti down from their carriages so that it falls like a soft shower of rain, many of the Romans fling it with such force that without a mask the eyes might suffer considerably. The brim of one's hat and every fold in one's clothes, however, are full of little balls. Most people go about with a huge, full bag by their side. Others on the balconies have immense baskets standing, which are hardly empty before they are filled by eager sellers. All the ladies standing in the windows, who were disguised as Turkish ladies or workwomen from the port, had a deep wooden trough, quite full, brought outside their windows, and into this supply dipped continually in the street, which had been covered with soil for the sake of the horse racing, was a crowd of people in fancy dress, many of them having great fun and being very amusing. One old woman in a chemise was amongst the best. A young fellow, dressed entirely in scarlet, more particularly amused himself by putting the officers of the National Guard, who were walking about to keep order, out of countenance. When they were looking especially stern, he would go up to them and tickle them on the cheeks, and talk baby talk to them, and they had to put the best face they could on it. The street life and the pedestrians, however, did not attract much attention. All the interest was centered on the carriages and the games between them and the windows and balconies. The people in carriages were all in fancy dress. Amongst them one noticed charming groups of Roman ladies in light cloaks of red silk, with a red steel wire mask before their faces, through which one could catch a glimpse of their features. There was a swarm of delightful figures, certainly half of them in men's clothes, armed young sailors, for instance. Fine, happy faces, and the young men how handsome, not flashing eyes, as people affectedly say, but happy eyes. A good, healthy physique, an expression which seemed to say that they had breathed in sunshine and happiness and all the beatitude of laziness, all the mild and good-humored comfort of leisure, all their lives long. One party had a colossal cart with outriders and postilions, and hung in the yards, and stood on the thwarts of a large cutter poised upon it, in becoming naval officers' dress, flinging magnificent bouquets to all the beautiful ladies who drove past. The bouquets would have cost several lire each, and they flung them by the hundred, so they must have been young fellows of means. The throwing of confetti is merely bellicose and ordinary. Infinitely more interesting is the coquettish, ingratiating, genuinely Italian flinging backwards and forwards of bouquets. The grace and charm of the manner in which they are flung and caught, nothing can surpass. There may be real passion in the way in which 6 or 7 bouquets in succession are flung at one and the same lady, who never omits to repay in similar coin. One carriage was especially beautiful. It had a huge square erection upon it, entirely covered with artificial roses and greenery, which reached almost to the second story of the houses, and upon it, in 2 rows, facing both sides of the streets, stood the loveliest Roman girls imaginable, flinging bouquets unceasingly. Most of the carriages have tall poles sticking up with a crossway bar at the top, and there are bouquets on every bar, so there is a constant supply to draw from. Beautiful Princess Margarita was, of course, the object of much homage, although her balcony was on the 2nd floor. One form this took was very graceful. A few young gentlemen in blue and white drove slowly past. One of them had a large flat basket filled with lovely white roses. He stuck a long halberd through the handle and hoisted the basket up to the princess, being richly rewarded with bouquets. One wag hit upon an idea that was a brilliant success. At 5 o'clock he sent a bladder, in the shape of a huge turkey, up in the flickering sunlight. It was so fixed up as to move its head about, with an expression of exceedingly ridiculous sentimentality, now to the right, now caressingly to the left, as it ascended. The whole corso rang again with laughter and clapping. The horse racing at the end was not of much account. The horses start excited by the rocket let off at their tails, and by all the sharp pellets hanging around about them, to say nothing of the howling of the crowd. At 6 o'clock I was at home and in bed. KB has been here to see me. Philomena hates and despises him from the bottom of her heart since the day that he got drunk on my wine. When he was gone, she said, "Brutta bestia, I forgot to look whether he was clean today." She and Maria declare that he is the only one of all my acquaintances who does not wear clean linen. This point of cleanliness is a mild obsession of Philomena's just now. She prides herself greatly on her cleanliness and asks me every day whether she is clean or not. She is a new convert to cleanliness, and renegades or newly initiated people are in all religions the most violent. When I came to the house, her face was black, and she washed her hands about once a day. R then remarked about her, which was a slight exaggeration, that, if one were to set her up against the wall, she would stick fast. She noticed with unfeigned astonishment how many times I washed myself, and asked for fresh water, how often I had clean shirts, etc. This made a profound impression on her young mind, and after I came back from the hospital, she began in earnest to rub her face with a sponge and to wash herself 5 or 6 times a day, likewise to wash the handkerchiefs she wears round her neck. Maria looks on at all this with surprise. She says, like the old woman in Tonietta, by Henrik Hertz, a great, strong girl like that does not need to wash and splash herself all over like an Englishwoman. The lectures she has given me every time I have wanted to wash myself, on the harm water does an invalid, are many and precious. Whenever I ask for water I might be wanting to commit suicide. It is only after repeated requests that she brings it, and then with a quiet, resigned expression, as if to say, "I have done my best to prevent this imprudence. I wash my hands of all responsibility." Philomena, in her new phase of development, is quite different. She looks at my shirt with the eyes of a connoisseur and says, "It will do for tomorrow, a clean one the day after tomorrow." Or, "Did you see what beautiful cuffs the tall, dark man 1000 the painter had on yesterday?" Or, "Excuse my skirt being so marked now, I am going to have a clean one later in the day." Or, "Is my cheek dirty?" I do not think so, for I have washed myself twice today. You must remember that I am very dark complexioned, almost like a Moor. Or else there will be a triumphal entry into my room, with a full water can in her hand, one of the very large ones that are used here. "What is that, Philomena? What am I to do with that?" "Look, sir, it is full." "Well, what of that? It is the waiter's water can. It has been standing there full for 10 days scornfully. He is afraid of water. He only uses it for his coffee. She has forgotten how few months it is since she herself was afraid of water. She came in while I was eating my supper and remarked, "You always read at your meals. How can you eat and read at the same time? I do not know what reading is like, but I thought it was more difficult than that. It is a great misfortune for me that I can neither read nor write. Supposing I were to be ill like you, how should I pass away the time? There was no school at Camerino, where I was born, and I lived in the country till I was 18 and learnt nothing at all. We were 9 brothers and sisters. There was seldom any food in the house. Sometimes we worked. Sometimes we lay on the ground. It is unfortunate that I cannot read, for I am not at all beautiful. If I could only do something, I should be able to get a husband. Do not you know any of the letters, Philomena?" "No, sir, do not trouble about that. You are happier than I, who know a great deal more than you. You laugh and sing all day long. I neither laugh nor sing." "Dear sir, you will laugh and sing as well when you get home. Then your little girl Ragazza, who is so appassionato that she writes 4 letters a day, will make fate for you, and I think that when you go to the osteria with your friends you laugh. It is enough now for you to be patient." As she had spoken about getting a husband, I asked, "Are your sisters married?" "They are all older than I and married," saving her pride in the first part of her reply. After a few minutes' reflection, she went on, "I, for my part, will not have a husband under 30. The young ones all beat their wives." Shortly afterwards, I put an end to the audience. We had had a few short discussions, and I had been vanquished, apparently by her logic, but chiefly by reason of her better mastery of the language, and because I defended all sorts of things in joke. At last I said, "Have you noticed, Philomena, that when we argue it is always you who silence me? So you can see, in spite of all my reading, that you have better brains than one." This compliment pleased her. She blushed and smiled without being able to find a reply. She realizes the northern ideal of the young woman not spoilt by novel reading. Nor does she lack intelligence, although she literally does not know what north and south mean. She is modest, refined in her way, and happy over very little. For the moment, she is engaged in making the little dog bark like mad by aggravatingly imitating the mewing of a cat. Later, the boy from the cafe brings me my supper. What has become of Philomena? I wonder if she is out. I cannot hear her having her evening fight with the boy in the passage. She likes to hit him once a day for exercise. Maria comes in. "Do you hear the cannon, sir? What do you think it is?" I reply calmly, "It is war. The Zouaves' papal troops are coming." Maria goes out and declares the reply of the oracle in the next room. Some cannon salutes really were being fired. Maria hurries down into the street to hear about it, and Philomena comes in to me. "I am afraid," she says. "Do you mean it?" She was laughing and trembling at the same time. I saw that the fear was quite real. "Is it possible that you can be so afraid? There is not really any war or any Zouaves. It was only a joke." That pacified her. "I was afraid, if you like," said she, "when the Italians, the Romans never called themselves Italians, marched into Rome. One shell came after another. One burst on the roof of the house opposite. Who are you for, the Pope or Vittorio? For neither. I am a stupid girl. I am for the one that will feed and clothe me. But I have often laughed at the Zouaves. One of them was standing here one day, taking pinch after pinch of snuff, and he said to me, 'The Italians will never enter Rome.' I replied, 'Not if they take snuff, but they will if they storm the town.' Do you think that the Pope will win? No, I think his cause is lost. Perhaps there will even come a time when no one goes to churches here. She who goes to church, the girls to meet their lovers, the young men to see a pretty shop girl. We laugh at the priests. Why? Because they are ridiculous. If it thunders, they say at once that it is a sign from God. The sky happens to be flaming red, like it was last October. That was because the Italians entered Rome in September. Everything is a sign from God, a sign of his anger, his exasperation. He is not angry, that is clear enough. If he had not wanted the Italians to come in, they would not have come, but would all have died at once." She said this last with great earnestness and pathos, with an upward movement of her hand, and bowed her head, like one who fears an unknown power. Maria returned, saying people thought the shots meant that Garibaldi had come. Said I, "There, he is a brave man. Try to be like him, Philomena. It is not right for a big strong girl to tremble." She, "I am not strong, but still, I am stronger than you, who have been weakened so much by your illness, and yet, who knows, you have been much better the last few days. Shall we try?" I placed my right hand in hers, first tested her strength a little, and then found to my surprise that her arm was not much stronger than that of an ordinary lady. Then I bent my fingers a little and laid her very neatly on the floor. I was sitting in bed. She was on her knees in front of the bed, but I let her spring up. It was a pretty sight, the blue-black hair, the laughing mouth with the fine white teeth, the brown, smiling eyes. As she got up, she said, "You are well now. I am not sorry to have been conquered. Have taken my second flight. I have been at the Makali fete, had myself carried and driven there and back like last time. Cerdo had taken a room on the Corso. I saw everything from there, and now I have the delightful impressions of it all left. What exuberant happiness, what jubilation, what childlike gaiety. It is like going into a nursery and watching the children play, hearing them shout and enjoy themselves like mad, as one can shout and enjoy things oneself no longer. I arrived late and only saw the end of the processions, far more carriages, wilder shouting, more madness, bacchantic, stormy, than last time. The whole length of the Corso was one shriek of laughter. And how many lovely faces at the windows, on the balconies and verandas. Large closed carriages with hidden music inside and graceful ladies on the top. As I pretty, the Catholic papers had said that all who took part in the carnival were paid by the government, a number of men and women, in the handsomest carriage according to the Nuova Roma for today, more than 20,000 had the word pagato paid fastened to their caps, which evoked much amusement. Then the lancers cleared the street at full gallop for the horse races Barbary, and at once an immense procession of Polichinelli and ridiculous equestrians in Don Quixote armor organized itself and rode down the Corso at a trot in parody. Then came the mad, snorting horses. Then a few minutes, and night fell over the 7 heights of Rome, and the Corso itself lay in darkness. Then the first points of light began to make their appearance. Here below one little shimmer of light, and up there another, and 2 there, and 6 here, and 10 down there to the left, and hundreds on the right, and then thousands, and many, many thousands. From one end of the great long street to the other, from the first floor to the roof of every house and every palace, there is one steady twinkling of tiny flames, of torches, of large and small lights. The effect is surprising and peculiar. As soon as the first light appeared, young men and girls ran and tried to blow each other's candles out. Even the children took part in the game. I could see into several houses where it was going on briskly. Then, from every side street decorated carriages began to drive on to the Corso again, but this time every person held a candle in his hand. Yes, and that was not all. At least every other of the large wagons were like immense boxes of flour shed, on poles, or made fast, Bengal fire of various colors, which lighted up every house they went past, now with a red, now with a green flare. And then the thousands of small candles, from everyone in the throng, from carriages, balconies, verandas, sparkled in the great flame, fighting victoriously with the last glimmer of daylight. People ran like mad down the Corso and fanned out the lights in the carriages. But many a Roman beauty found a better way of lighting up her features without exposing herself to the risk of having her light put out. Opposite me, for instance, on the second floor, a lovely girl was standing in a window. In the shutter by her side, she had fixed one of those violent red flares so that she stood in a bright light, like sunlight seen through red glass, and it was impossible not to notice her. Meanwhile, the people on the balconies held long poles in their hands, with which they unexpectedly put out the small candles in the carriages. You heard incessantly, through the confusion, the shouts of individuals one to another, and their jubilation when a long attempted and cleverly foiled extinguishing was at length successful, and the clapping and shouts of bravo at an unusually brightly lighted and decorated carriage. The pickpockets meanwhile did splendid business. Many of the Danes lost their money. At 8 o'clock I was in bed again, and shortly afterwards the people of the house came home for a moment. Philomena looked splendid and was very talkative. Lei e ingrassato, she called in through the door. It is her great pleasure that the hollows in my cheeks are gradually disappearing. She was now ascribing a special efficacy in this direction to Makali Eve. At 10:30 in the morning, there is a curious spectacle in the street here. At that time Domenico comes and the lottery begins. Lotteries are forbidden in Rome, but Domenico earns his 10 lire a day by them. He goes about this and the neighboring streets bawling and shouting until he has disposed of his 90 tickets. Girls and women lean out through the windows and call out the numbers they wish to have. In this respect, they are boundlessly credulous. They do not believe in the Pope, but they believe that there are numbers which they must become possessed of that day, even at the highest price, which is 2 soldi. The soldi are thrown out through the window, and each one remembers her own number. Then Domenico goes through all the numbers in a loud voice, that there may be no cheating. A child draws a number out of the bag, and Domenico shouts, "Listen, all purificazioni, number 34 has won, listen, purificazioni, 34. The disappointed faces disappear into the houses. All those who have had 33, 35, and 36 rail against unjust fate in strong terms. At the first rattle of the lottery bag, Philomena rushes in here, opens the window, and calls for a certain number. If anyone else wants it, she must manage to find 2 soldi in her pocket. If I fling a few soldi from my bed towards the window, this facilitates the search. However, we never win. Philomena declares that I have indescribable luck in gambling and suggests a reason. She was again singing outside. I called her, wanting to know what it was she kept singing all the time. "They are songs from the mountains," she replied, "all canzone d'amore." "Say them slowly, Philomena, I will write them down." I began, but was so delighted at the way she repeated the verses, her excellent declamatory and rhythmic sense, that I was almost unable to write. And to my surprise, I discovered that they were all what we call ritornellos. But written down, they are dull larvae, compared with what they are with the proper pronunciation and expression. What is it Byron says? "I love the language, that soft bastard Latin, which melts like kisses from a female mouth, and sounds as if it should be writ on satin." I shall really feel a void when Philomena goes away. The unfortunate part of it is that her dialect pronunciation is so difficult to make out, and that she swallows so many syllables in order to make the meter right, as there are generally too many feet, and it is only the delicacy of her declamation that makes up for the incorrectness of the rhymes and the verses. For instance, she constantly says lo instead of il lo soldato, and she can never tell me how many words there are in a line, since neither she nor Maria knows what a single word, as opposed to several, is, and because it is no use spelling the word to her and asking, "Is that right?" since she cannot spell and does not recognize the letters. Cerdo tells me that a driver who once drove him and his wife about for 5 days in Tuscany sang all day long like Philomena and improvised all the time. This is what she too does continually. She inserts different words which have about the same meaning and says, "It is all the same, sia la stessa cosa." On the other hand, she always keeps to the meter, and that with the most graceful intonation, never a faulty verse. "Fior di Giacinto, la donna ci per l'uomo piange tanto. Il pianto del don e pianto finto. Amore mio, non prendite la fiori di nessuno. Si vu un garofletto, lo do io. Fior di limone, limone e agra e la fronde son amer. Ma son più amer la pin d'amer. Lo mi amore ci si chiama pep. Lo primo giuocata del cart. Prendo cuor e giuoca a tresset." Footnote: Flower of the hyacinth, the woman who weeps so much for the man's sake. Yet the complaint of women is a feigned one. "My love, do not accept flowers from anyone. If thou wilt have a wallflower, I will give it thee. Flower of the lemon. The lemon is sharp, and its leaves are bitter. But more bitter are the torments of love. My beloved, whose name is Pep. He is the first to play cards. He has taken this heart and is playing a game of 3 to 7 with it." In this way, I wrote out some scores. Spent an hour teaching Philomena her large letters up to N and making her say them by rote, and with that end in view have divided them into 3 portions sap diffgilm. She manages all right, except that she always jumps E and 50. Lesson closed. "Were you at church today, Philomena?" "No, I have nothing to confess." "Did you go to church last Sunday?" "No, I have not been for 6 weeks now." "I have committed no sin. What wrong do I do?" "I have no love affair, nothing." "What used you to confess?" "A few bad words which had slipped out." "Now I do nothing wrong. But one can go wrong without committing any sin when one is high-minded, for instance." "I am not high-minded." If you, on the other hand, were to imagine yourself better than the friends who come to visit you, that would be quite natural, for you are better. The day has been long. This evening the girl had errands to do for me. She came in here after her Sunday walk in the Campagna. I said, "Shall we read?" Just then a band of young people passed along the street with a harmonica and a lot of castanets, and commenced a song in honor of Garibaldi. With all its simplicity, it sounded unspeakably affecting. I was quite softened. She replied, "With pleasure." I thought to myself, now to see whether she remembers a word of what I said to her yesterday. But she went on at once, "Signor, I have been industrious." She had bought herself an ABC and had taught herself alone not only all the large letters, but also all the little ones, and had learnt them all off by heart as well. I was so astonished that I almost fell back in the bed. "But what is this, Philomena? Have you learnt to read from someone else?" "No, only from you yesterday. But for 5 years, my only wish has been to learn to read, and I am so glad to be able to. I wanted to teach her to spell. I almost think I can a little." And she was already so far that without spelling first read a whole page of two-letter spellings, almost without a mistake. She certainly very often said, "de ad," or "read fo for of," but her progress was amazing. When she spells, she takes the words as a living reality, not merely as words, and adds something to them, for instance, sa, li, re, salahira less scale, jump down the stairs. "Philomena, I could teach you to read in 3 weeks." I have always thought it the greatest shame for a man or woman not to be able to read. I told her something about the progress of the human race, that the first men and women had been like animals, not at all like Adam and Eve. Do you think I believed that Eve ate an apple and that the serpent could speak? Non credo ment. Such things are like Malachi belief in the evil eye, and without any transition, she begins, sempre allegra, as she calls herself, to sing a gay song. Just now she is exceedingly delighted with a certain large red shawl. There came a peddler to the door. She sighed deeply at the sight of the brilliant red, so I gave it her. She is a great lover and a connoisseur of wine, like myself. We taste and drink together every dinner time. As she always waits upon me, I often give her a little cake and wine while I am eating. Now we have begun a new wine, white Roman muscat, but I change my wine almost every other day. Philomena had taken the one large bottle and stacked up newspapers round it on the table, so that if KB came he should not see it. It so happened that he came today, whilst I was dining and she eating with me. There was a ring, she wanted to go. Stay, perhaps it is not for me at all, and in any case, I do not ask anyone's permission for you to be here. He came in and said in Danish, as he put his hat down, "Oh, so you let the girl of the house dine with you? I should not care for that." Philomena, who noticed his glance in her direction and his gesture, said, with as spiteful a look, and in as cutting a voice as she could muster, "Il signor prend, il suo pranzo con chi lui per I pius." The gentleman eats with whomsoever he pleases. Does she understand Danish? He asked in astonishment. It looks like it, I replied. When he had gone, her furia broke loose. I saw her exasperated for the first time, and it sat very comically upon her. "Did you ask him whom he eats with? Did he say I was ugly? Did you ask him whether his ragazza was prettier?" She meant a Danish lady, a married woman, with whom she had frequently met KB in the street. She said to me yesterday, "There is one thing I can do, sir, that you cannot. I can carry 200 pounds weight on my head. I can carry 2 conkers, or, if you like to try me, all that wood lying there." She has the proud bearing of the Romans. Read with Philomena for an hour and a half. She can now spell words with 3 letters fairly well. This language has such a sweet ring that her spelling is like music, and to see the innocent reverence with which she says gra, it is what a poet might envy me. And then the earnest, inquiring glance she gives me at the end of every line. It is marvelous to see this complete absorption of a grown-up person in the study of ob, and yet at the same time there is something almost great in this ravenous thirst for knowledge, combined with incredulity of all tradition. It is a model such as this that the poets should have had for their naive characters. In Goethe's Roman elegies, the Roman woman's figure is very inconspicuous. She is not drawn as a genuine woman of the people. She is not naive. He knew a Faustina, but one feels that he afterwards slipped a German model into her place. Philomena has the uncompromising honesty and straightforwardness of an unspoilt soul. Her glance is not exactly pure, but free. How shall I describe it? Full, grand, simple. With a conker on her head, she would look like a caryatid. If I compare her mentally with a feminine character of another poet, Lamartine's Graziella, an Italian girl of the lower classes, like herself, I cannot but think Graziella thin and poetized down to her name. The narrator, if I remember rightly, teaches her to read too, but Graziella herself does not desire it. It is he who educates her. Philomena, on the contrary, with her anxiety to learn, is an example and a symbol of a great historic movement, the poor, oppressed Roman people's craving for light and knowledge. Of Italy's population of 26 millions, according to the latest, most recent statistics, 17 millions can neither read nor write. She said to me today, "What do you really think, sir? Do you not believe that the Holy Ghost is univertu and cannot be father of the child?" "You are right, Philomena. That is why I never pray. Some day, when you are very unhappy, perhaps you will pray." I have been very unhappy. When I was a child, I used to suffer horribly from hunger. I had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to work and got 8 soldi for standing all day long in a vineyard in the sun and digging with a spade. And as corn was dear and meat dear, we 7 children seldom had a proper meal. Last year, too, I was hungry often, for it was as the proverb says, "If I eat, I cannot dress myself, and if I dress myself, I cannot eat." What a sad and illuminating proverb. Sir, if there were any paradise, you would go there for what you do for me. If I can only read and write, I can earn twice as much as I otherwise could. Then I can be a camerera and bring my mistress a written account of expenditure every week. Philomena knows that Cerdo is a professor at the university, but she does not know what a professor or a university is. She puts her question like this: "Probably my idea of what a university is may not be quite correct." No one comes now. An invalid is very interesting at first and arouses sympathy. If he continue ill too long, people unconsciously think it impossible for him to get well and stay away. So the only resource left me all day is to chat with Philomena, to whom Maria has entrusted the nursing of me. Every evening I read with her. Yesterday she had her 4th lesson and could almost read straight off. Her complexion and the lower part of her face are like a child's. Her undeveloped mental state reveals itself thus far in her appearance. I told her yesterday, as an experiment, that there were 5 continents, and in each of them many countries, but she cannot understand yet what I mean, as she has no conception of what the earth looks like. She does not even know in what direction from Rome her native village, Camerino, lies. I will try to get hold of a map or a globe. Yesterday, we read the word inferno. She said there is no hell, things are bad enough on earth. If we are to burn afterwards, there would be 2 hells. Good gracious, Philomena, is life so bad? Why, you sing all day long. I sing because I am well. That is perfectly natural, but how can I be content? What do you wish for then? So much money, denarii, that I should be sure of never being hungry again. You do not know how it hurts. Then there is one other thing I should like, but it is impossible. I should like not to die. I am so horribly afraid of death. I should certainly wish there were a paradise, but who can tell? Still, my grandmother lived to be 100 all but 3 years, and she was never ill for a day. When she was only 3 years from being 100, she still went to the fields like the rest of us and worked, and was like a young woman giovanata. Mother is 42, but although she is 2 years older than my aunt, she looks quite young. Kylo sa, perhaps I may live to be 100 too, never be ill, I never have been yet, one single day, and then go in and lie down on the bed like she did and be dead at once. She really is sweet, said R this evening. The word does not fit. Her laugh, her little grimaces, her witticisms, quaint conceits and gestures are certainly very attractive, but her mode of expression, when she is talking freely, is very unreserved, and if I were to repeat some of her remarks to a stranger, he would perhaps think her coarse or loose. We shall see what sort of a girl you bring home to us when you are well again, and whether you have as good taste as our Frenchman, or perhaps you would rather visit her. I know how a fine gentleman behaves when he visits his friend. She is often a lady and rich. He comes, knocks softly at the door, sits down, and talks about difficult and learned things. Then he begs for a kiss. She flings her arms round his neck. Allora, il letto rifatto, va via. She neither blushes nor feels the slightest embarrassment when she talks like this. How do you know such things when you have no experience? People have told me. I know it from hearsay. I myself have never been in love, but I believe that it is possible to love one person one's whole life long and never grow tired of him and never love another. You said the other day for a joke that people ought to marry for a year or 6 months, but I believe that one can love the same person always. In such chat my days pass by. I feel as though I had dropped down somewhere in the Sabine Mountains, been well received in a house. Maria is from Camerino, too, and were living there hidden from the world among these big children. Yesterday, Uncle had his National Guard uniform on for the first time. He came in to show himself. I told him that it suited him very well, which delighted him. Philomena exhibited him with admiration. When Maria came home later on, she asked the others at once, "Has the Signor seen him? What did he say? Does not he want to see him again?" Written down a score of ritornellos, I have chosen the best of them. Many of them are rather or very indecent, but as Philomena says, you do not go to hell for singing canzone, you cannot help what they are like. The indecent ones she will only say at a terrific rate and not a second time, but if one pay attention, they are easy to understand. They are a mixture of audacity and simple vulgarity. They all begin with flowers. She is too undeveloped to share the educated girl's abhorrence of things that are in bad taste. Everything natural, she thinks, can be said, and she speaks out, quite unperturbed. Still, now she understands that there are certain impossible things that I do not like to hear her say. I was sitting cutting a wafer to take powders with into oblates. You must not cut into consecrated things, not even put the teeth into it. The priest says, thou shalt not bite Christ. Unfortunately, she has not any real impression of religion, either of its beauty or its underlying truth. None of them have any idea of what the New Testament is or contains. They do not know its best-known quotations and stories. Religion, to them, is 4 or 5 rigmaroles, which are printed in our abecedario, the Creed, the Ave Maria, the various sacraments, etc., which they know by heart. These they reject, but they have not the slightest conception of what Christianity is. If I quote a text from the New Testament, they have never heard it. But they can run the 7 cardinal virtues and the 7 other virtues off by rote. One of these last, that of instructing the ignorant, is a virtue which the priesthood, partly for good reasons, have not practiced to any remarkable extent in this country. Yesterday Maria came home in a state of great delight from a trattoria where a gentleman had spoken tanto bene against religion and the Pope and the priests. There were a few Caxiopri present a derogatory expression for adherents of the priests who had just had to come down a peg or two. When she had finished, to my astonishment, she said to me exactly this: "It is nature that is God, is it not so?" An expression almost symbolical of the ignorance and credulity of the Romans is their constant axiom, "Kai lo sa," who knows? I said to Maria the other day, after she had said it for the 4th time in a quarter of an hour, "My good Maria, the beginning of wisdom is not to fear God, but to say perche, why, instead of Kai lo sa." Yesterday, while I was eating my dinner, I heard Philomena's story. She came to Rome last December. You think I came because Maria wanted to help Mother. I came to Rome because there was a man who wanted to marry me. What was his name? His name was Pep. Lo mi amore ci si chiama Pep. Ah, I do not love him at all. No, the thing is that at Camerino, all the men beat their wives. My sister, for instance, has always a black eye and red stripes on her back. My friend Marietta always gets beaten by her husband, and the more he beats her, the more she loves him. Sometimes she goes away from him for a few days to her sister, but she always goes back again. What has that to do with our friend Pep? Well, you see, Mother knew that Pep's brother beat his wife all day and all night, so she would not give me to him. Yes, it was bad if it were a family failing. So one evening Father said to me, "Your aunt has written to us from Rome to ask whether you will pay her a visit of a few days." And he showed me a false letter. Aunt cannot write and knew nothing about any letter. I did not want too much, said I would not, but came here all the same, and found that I was to stay here, and that Mother did not want me to have Pep. So I began to cry, and for 5 whole days I cried all the time and would neither eat nor drink. Then I thought to myself, it is all over between Pep and me. Shall I cry myself to death for a man? So I left off crying and very soon forgot all about him. And after a week's time, I did not care anything about the whole matter and sang and was happy, and now I want to stay in Rome always. Last night I got up for a little, read with Philomena, and determined to go in and have supper with the family in their little room. Philomena opened the door wide and called out along the corridor, "Ecolo," and then such a welcome as there was for the invalid, now that he had at last got up, and I was obliged to drink 2 large beer glasses of the homegrown wine. First Maria told how it was that I had always had everything so punctually whilst I was 99. It was because Philomena had made the little boy from the café believe that I was going to give him my watch when I got well, if he never let anything get cold. So the boy ran as though possessed, and once fell down the stairs and broke everything to atoms. "He is delirious," said Philomena one day, "and talks of nothing but of giving you his watch." "How can he be so ill," said the boy suspiciously, "when he eats and drinks?" "Do you want the watch or not?" said Philomena, and off the lad ran. I let the others entertain me. Maria said, "You told Philomena something yesterday about savages. I know something about them too. Savage people live in China, and the worst of all are called mandarins. Do you know what one of them did to an Italian lady? She was with her family over there. Suddenly there came a mandarin, carried her off, and shut her up in his house. They never found her again. Then he had 3 children by her. But one day he went out and forgot to shut the door. She ran quickly out of the house, down to the water, and saw a ship far away. Do you know what the mandarin did, sir, when he came home and found that his wife was gone? He took the 3 children, tore them through the middle, and threw the pieces out into the street. It reminded one of Lucidarius and other medieval legends. Then our good Zio, the honest uncle, began and told Maria and Philomena the history of Napoleon I fairly correctly. He had heard it from his master Leonardo, who taught him his trade. The man had taken part in 5 of the campaigns. The only egregious mistake he made was that he thought the Austrians had gradually poisoned the Duke of Reichstadt because he threatened to become even more formidable than his father, but that the old grenadier might easily have believed. The thing that astonished me was that the narrative did not make the slightest impression upon either Maria or Philomena. I asked Philomena if she did not think it was very remarkable, but she clearly had a suspicion that it was all lies. Besides, what has happened in the world before her day is of as little importance to her as what goes on in another planet. Finally, she abominates war. Zio concluded his story with childlike self-satisfaction. When I learnt about all this, I was only an apprentice. Now I am Mastro Nino. These last few days that I have been able to stumble about the room a little, I have had a feeling of delight and happiness such as I have hardly experienced before. The very air is a fete. The little black-haired youngsters running about this picturesquely steep street are my delight whenever I look out of the window. All that is in front of me, the splendors of Rome, the summer, the art of Italy, Naples in the south, Venice in the north, makes my heart beat fast and my head swim. I only need to turn round from the window and see Philomena standing behind me, knitting, posed like a living picture by Kuchler to feel, with jubilation, I am in Rome. Cerdo came today at 12 o'clock and saw me dressed for the first time. I had put on my nicest clothes. I called Philomena, had 3 dinners fetched, and seated between him and her I had my banquet. I had just said, I will not eat any soup today unless it should happen to be zuppa de herba. Philomena took the lid off and cried, "Apunto, this is how all my wishes are fulfilled now." I had a fine, light red wine. It tasted so good that if the gods had known it, they would have poured their nectar into the washtub. Philomena poured it out, singing, "E l'acqua fa mer, il vino fa canter, il sugo della gresta, fa gira la testa." Water is bad for one. Wine makes one sing. The juice of the grape makes the head swim. Tomorrow I may go out. After Sunday, I shall leave off dining at home. On Sunday, Philomena goes to Camerino. Second, longer stay abroad. Continued. Reflections on the Future of Denmark Conversations with Giuseppe Cerdo Frascati, Native Beauty New Susceptibilities Georges, Newfloods Influence the Sistine Chapel, and Michelangelo, Raphael's Loggia's Radiant Spring. One Cerdo said to me one day, "I'm not going to flatter you, I have no interest in doing so, but I am going to give you a piece of advice, which you ought to think over. Stay in Italy, settle down here, and you will reach a far higher position than you can possibly attain in your own country. The intellectual education you possess is exceedingly rare in Italy. What I can say, without exaggeration, is that in this country it is so extraordinary that it might be termed an active force. Within 2 years you would be a power in Italy, at home, You will never be more than a professor at a university. Stay here, Villari, and I will help you over your first difficulties. Write in French or Italian, which you like, and as you are master of the entire range of Germanic culture, which scarcely any man in Italy is, you will acquire an influence of which you have not the least conception. A prophet is never honored in his own country. We, on the other hand, need you. So stay here. Take Max Muller as an example. It is with individuals as with nations. It is only when they change their soil that they attain their full development and realize their own strength. I replied, I am deaf to that sort of thing. I love the Danish language too well ever to forsake it. Only in the event of my settlement in Denmark meeting with opposition and being rendered impassable shall I strap on my knapsack, gird up my loins, and hie me to France or Italy. I am glad to hear that the world is not so closed to me as I had formerly believed. My thoughts were much engaged on my sickbed by reflections upon the future of Denmark. The following entry is dated March 8, 1871. What do we mean by our national future, which we talk so much about? We do not purpose to extend our borders, to make conquests, or play any part in politics. For that, as is well comprehensible, we know we are too weak. I will leave alone the question as to whether it is possible to live without, in one way or another, growing, and ask, what do we want? To continue to exist. How exist? We want to get Schleswig back again, for as it is we are not existing. We are sickening, or else we are living like those lower animals who, even when they are cut in pieces, are quite nimble, but it is a miserable life. We are in a false position with regard to Germany. The centripetal force that draws the individual members of one nationality together, and which we in Denmark call Danishness, that which, further, draws nationalities of the same family together, and which in Denmark is called Scandinavianism, must logically lead to a sympathy for the merging of the entire race, a kind of Gotho-Germanism. If we seek support from France, we shall be behaving like the Poles, turning for help to a foreign race against a nation of our own. I accuse us, not of acting imprudently, but of fighting against a natural force that is stronger than we. We can only retard, we cannot annihilate, the attraction exerted by the greater masses on the lesser. We can only hope that we may not live to feel the agony. Holland and Denmark are both threatened by Germany, for in this geography is the mighty ally of Germany. The most enlightened Dane can only cherish the hope that Denmark, conquered or not conquered, will brave it out long enough for universal civilization, by virtue of the level it has reached, to bring our independence with it. As far as the hope which the majority of Danes cherish is concerned, including the noble professors of philosophy, of a time when Nemesis reminiscence of theology shall descend on Prussia, this hope is only an outcome of foolishness, and even a Nemesis upon Prussia will never hurt Germany, and thus will not help us. But the main question is this: if whether through a peaceable restoration of Schleswig, or after fresh wars, or through the dawning of an era of peace and civilization regain our integrity and independence, shall we exist then? Not at all. Then we shall sicken again. A country like Denmark, even including Schleswig, is nowadays no country at all. A tradesman whose whole capital consists of 10 rigsdaler is no tradesman. The large capitals swallow up the small. The small must seek their salvation in associations, partnerships, joint stock companies, etc. Our misfortune lies in the fact that there is no other country with which we can enter into partnership except Sweden and Norway, a little unimportant state. By means of this association, which for the time being is our sheet anchor, and which, by dint of deploying enormous energy, might be of some importance, we can at best retard our destruction by a year or two. But the future, has Denmark any future? It was France who, to her own unspeakable injury, discovered, or rather, first proclaimed, the principle of nationality, a principle which at most could only give her Belgium and French Switzerland, two neutral countries guaranteed by Europe, but which gave Italy to Piedmont, Germany to Prussia, and which one day will give Russia supremacy over all the Slavs. Even before the war, France was, as it were, squeezed between bucklers. She had no possible chance of gaining anything through her own precious principle, and did not even dare to apply it to the two above-mentioned points. While she fearfully allowed herself to be awarded Savoy and Nice, Prussia grew from 19 million inhabitants to 50 millions, and probably in a few years, the Germans of Austria will fall to Germany as well. Then came the war, and its outcome was in every particular what Provost Paradol, with his keen foresight, had predicted. Afterwards, he wrote, France, with Paris, will take up in Europe the same position as Hellas with Athens assumed in the old Roman Empire. It will become the city of taste and the noble delights, but it will never be able to regain its power. It has, in fact, been killed by this very theory of nationality, for the only cognate races, Spain and Italy, are two countries of which the one is rotten, the other just entered upon the convalescent stage. Thus it is clear that Germany will, for a time, exercise the supreme sway in Europe. But the future belongs neither to her nor to Russia, but if not to England herself, at any rate to the Anglo-Saxon race, which has revealed a power of expansion in comparison with which that of other nations is too small to count. Germans who go to North America in the next generation speak English. The English have a unique capacity for spreading themselves and introducing their language, and the power which the Anglo-Saxon race will acquire cannot be broken in course of time like that of ancient Rome. For there are no barbarians left, and their power is based not on conquest, but on assimilation, and the race is being rejuvenated in North America. How characteristic it is of our poor little country that we always hear and read of it as one of the oldest kingdoms in the world. That is just the pity of it. If we were only a young country, there is only one way by which we can rejuvenate ourselves. First, to merge ourselves into Scandinavia, then, when this is well done and well secured, to approach the Anglo-Saxon race to which we are akin. Moral: become an Anglo-Saxon and study John Stuart Mill. And I studied Mill with persevering attention, where he was difficult but instructive to follow, as in the examination of Hamilton's philosophy, which renews Berkeley's teachings, and I read him with delight where, accessible and comprehensible, he proclaims with freshness and vigor the gospel of a new age, as in the book on liberty and the one akin to it, representative government. 2. During the months of February and March, my conversations with Giuseppe Cerdo had been all I lived for. We discussed all the questions which one or both of us had at heart, from the causes of the expansion of Christianity to the method of proportionate representation which Cerdo knew and correctly traced back to Andri. When I complained that, by reason of our different nationality, we could hardly have any recollections in common, and by reason of our different languages, could never cite a familiar adage from childhood or quote a common saying from a play, that the one could not thoroughly enjoy the harmony of verses in the language of the other, Cerdo replied, "You are no more a Dane than I am an Italian. We are compatriots in the great fatherland of the mind, that of Shakespeare and Goethe, John Stuart Mill, Andri and Cavour. This land is the land of humanity. Nationality is milk, humanity is cream. What is there in all the world that we have not in common? It is true that we cannot enjoy together the harmony of some northern verses, but we can assimilate together all the great ideas, and we have for each other the attraction of the relatively unknown, which fellow countrymen have not." He very acutely characterized his Italian compatriots. Our intelligence amounts to prudence and common sense. At a distance, we may appear self-luminous. In reality, we are only passivity and reflected light. Solferino gave us Lombardy, Padua gave us Venice, Sedan gave us Rome. We were just active enough to take advantage of fortunate circumstances and passively clever enough not to wreck our advantage by stupidity. In foreign novels, we are scoundrels of the deepest dye, concoctors of poisons and wholesale swindlers. In reality, we are indifferent and indolent. Dolce far niente, these words, which, to our shame, are repeated in every country in Italian, are our watchword. But things shall be different, if it means that the few amongst us who have a little share of head and heart have to work themselves to death. Things shall be different. Massimo D'Asglio said, "Now we have created an Italy, there remains to create Italians." That was a true saying. Now we are creating the new people, and what a future there is before us. Now it is we who are taking the leadership of the Latin race, and who are giving back to our history its brilliance of the 16th century. At present our art is poor because we have no popular type. But wait. In a few years Italy will show a profile no less full of character than in the days of Michelangelo and Benvenuto Cellini. 3. Then the moment arrived when all abstract reflections were thrust aside once more by convalescence. I was well again, after having been shut up for over 4 months. I still felt the traces of the mercury poisoning, but I was no longer tied to my bed, and weak though I was, I could walk. And on the very first day, it was March 25, armed with a borrowed stick I possessed none, having never used a stick before, and equipped with a little camp stool, I took the train to Frascati, where there was a Madonna fete. It was life opening out before me again, all that I saw, witness to its splendor. First, the scenery on the way, the Campagna with its proud ruins, and the snow-covered Sabine mountains, the whole illuminated by a powerful summer sun, the villas of old Romans, with fortress-like thick walls and small windows, then the fertile lava soil, every inch of which was under vineyard cultivation. At last the mountains in the neighborhood of Frascati. A convent crowned the highest point. There, in olden days, the first Italian temple to Jupiter had stood, and there Hannibal had camped. Underneath, in a hollow, like an eagle's nest, lay Rocca di Papa. By the roadside, fruit trees with violet clusters of blossoms against a background of stone pines, cypresses, and olive groves. I reached Frascati station. There was no carriage to be had up to the town, so I was obliged to ascend the hills slowly on foot, a test which my legs stood most creditably. In the pretty marketplace of Frascati, with its large fountain which, like a Paula, was divided into 3 and flung out a tremendous quantity of water, I went into an osteria and asked for roast goat with salad and Frascati wine, then sat down outside, as it was too close within. Hundreds of people in gay costumes, with artificial flowers and silver feathers in their headgear, filled the square in front of me, crowded the space behind me, laughed and shouted. The people seemed to be of a grander type, more lively, animated and exuberant than at the fair at Fiesole. The women were like Junos or Venuses. The men, even when clad in abominable rags, looked like Vulcans, blackened in their forges. They were all of larger proportions than northern men and women. A Roman beau, with a riding whip under his arm, was making sheep's eyes at a young local beauty, his courtship accompanied by the whines of the surrounding beggars. A signora from Albano was lecturing the waiter with the dignity of a queen for having brought her meat that was beneath all criticism. Yes, she even let the word porcheria escape her. A brown-bearded fellow came out of the inn with a large bottle of the heavenly Frascati wine, which the landlords here, even on festival occasions, never mix with water, and gave a whole family, sitting on donkeys, to drink out of one glass. Then he went to 2 little ones, who were holding each other round the waist, sitting on the same donkey, to 2 youths who were riding another, to a man and wife who sat on a third, and all drank, like the horsemen in Wouwerman's pictures, without dismounting. I got into an old, local omnibus, pulled by 3 horses, to drive the 2 miles to Grottaferrata, where the fair was. But the vehicle was hardly about to start uphill when, with rare unanimity, the horses reared, behaved like mad, and whirled it round 4 or 5 times. The driver, a fellow with one eye and a grey cap with a double red camellia in it, being drunk, thrashed the horses and shouted, while an old American lady with ringlets shrieked inside the omnibus, and bawled out that she had paid a franc beforehand, and now wanted to get out. The road was thronged with people walking, and there was just as many riding donkeys, all of them, even the children, already heated with wine, singing, laughing, and accosting everybody. Many a worthy woman supported her half-drunk husband with her powerful arm. Many a substantial signora from Rocca di Papa sat astride her mule, showing without the least bashfulness her majestic calves. At Grottaferrata, the long, long street presented a human throng of absolute density without the slightest crush, for no one stuck his elbows into his neighbor's sides. The eye could only distinguish a mass of red, yellow, and white patches in the sunlight, and in between them a few donkeys' heads and mules' necks. The patches were the kerchiefs on the women's heads. Folk stood with whole roast pigs in front of them on a board, cutting off a piece with a knife for anyone who was hungry. There were sold, besides, fruits, knives, ornaments, provisions, and general market wares. One osteria, the entrance to which was hung all over with sausages, onions, and vegetables in garlands, had 5 huge archways open to the street. Inside were long tables, at which people sat, not on benches, but on trestles, round bars supported by 2 legs, and ate and drank in the best of good spirits, and the blackest filth, for the floor was the black, sodden, trampled earth. Just over the way, arbors had been made from trees, by intertwining their branches and allowing them to grow into one another. These were quite full of gay, beautiful girls, amongst them one with fair hair and brown eyes, who looked like a Tuscan, and from whom it was difficult to tear one's eyes away. After having inspected the courtyard of an old monastery, the lovely pillars of which rejoiced my heart, I sat down a little on one side in the street where the fair was, on my little camp-stool, which roused the legitimate curiosity of the peasant girls. They walked round me, looked at me from behind and before, and examined with grave interest the construction of my seat. In front of me sat an olive and lemon seller. Girls bargained with him as best they could in the press, others stood and looked on. I had an opportunity here of watching their innate statuesque grace. When they spoke, the right arm kept time with their speech. When silent, they generally placed one hand on the hip, bent, but not clenched. There were various types. The little blonde, blue-eyed girl with the mild Madonna smile, an absolutely straight nose, and the larger maid, pronounced brunette. But the appearance of them all was such that an artist or a poet could, by a slight transformation, have portrayed from them whatever type of figure or special characteristic he required. In my opinion, the form Italian beauty took, and the reason of the feeling one had in Italy of wading in beauty, whereas one hardly ever saw anything in the strict sense of the word beautiful in Copenhagen, and rarely in Paris, was that this beauty was the beauty of the significant. All these women looked to be unoppressed, full-blown, freely developed. All that makes woman ugly in the north. The cold, the thick, ugly clothes that the peasant women wear, the doublet of embarrassment and vapidity which they drag about with them, the straight waistcoat of Christian's felt morality in which they are confined by the priests, by Protestantism, by fashion, by custom and convention of this oppressed, confined or contracted women here. These young peasant girls looked as if they had never heard such words as you must not, or you shall not, and as here in Italy there is none of the witty talk, the grinning behind people's backs, which takes the life out of all intrepidity in the north. No one thought, what will people say? Everyone dressed and deported himself with complete originality, as he or rather as she liked. Hence eyes were doubly brilliant, blood coursed twice as red, the women's busts were twice as rounded and full. For, from this time forth I had a strange experience. I saw beauty everywhere. If I sat at the window of a café on the Corso on a Sunday morning, as the ladies were going to Mass, it seemed to me that all the beauty on earth was going past. A mother and her 3 daughters went by, a mere grocer's wife from the Corso, but the mother carried herself like a duchess, had a foot so small that it could have lain in the hollow of my hand, and the youngest of the 3 daughters was so absolutely lovely that people turned to look after her. She might perhaps have been 15 years of age, but there was a nobility about her austere profile, and she had a way of twisting her perfect lips into a smile that showed her to be susceptible to the sweetest mysteries of poetry and music. My long illness had so quickened the susceptibility of my senses to impressions of beauty that I lived in a sort of intoxication. In the Scandinavian Club, I was received with endless expressions of sympathy, courteous remarks, and more or less sincerely meant flatteries, as if in compensation for the suffering I had been through. All spoke as though they had themselves been deeply distressed, and especially as though Copenhagen had been sitting weeping during my illness. I certainly did not believe this for a moment, but all the same it weighed down a little the balance of my happiness, and the first meetings with the northern artists in these glorious surroundings were in many respects very enjoyable. The Scandinavian Club was in the building from which you enter the Mausoleum of Augustus, a colossal building in the form of a cross, several stories in height. A festival had been got up on the flat roof for a benevolent object one of the first evenings in April. You mounted the many flights of stairs and suddenly found yourself, apparently, in an immense hall, but with no roof save the stars and brilliantly illuminated, but with lights that paled in the rays of the Italian moon. We took part in the peculiarly Italian enjoyment of watching balloons go up. They rose by fire, which exhausted the air inside them and made them light. Round about the moon we could see red and blue lights, like big stars. One balloon ignited up in the sky, burst into bright flames, and looked very impressive. Troops of young women, too, were sitting there, and dazzled anew a young man who for a second time had given the slip to the old gentleman with the scythe. There was one young servant girl from the country, in particular, a child of 13 or 14, to whom I called the attention of the painters, and they went into ecstasies over her. The type was the same as that which Raphael has reproduced in his Sistine Madonna. Her clear, dark blue eyes had a look of maidenly shyness and of the most exquisite bashfulness, and yet a look of pride. She wore a string of glass beads round her lovely neck. We ordered 2 bottles of wine to drink her health, and while we were drinking it, the rotunda was lighted up from a dozen directions with changing Bengal fire. The ladies looked even handsomer, the glass lamps dark green in the gleam, the fire-borne balloons rose, the orchestra played, the women smiled at the homage of their friends and love-a-soul on the venerable mausoleum of Augustus. 5. I made the acquaintance that evening of a young and exceedingly engaging Frenchman, who was to become my intimate friend and my traveling companion. He attracted me from the first by his refined, reserved, and yet cordial manner. Although only 35 years of age, George's Neuflard had traveled and seen surprisingly much. He was now in Italy for the second time, New France and Germany, had traveled through Mexico and the United States, had visited Syria, Egypt, Tunis, and Algiers to the last oasis. When the conversation touched upon art and music, he expressed himself in a manner that revealed keen perception, unusual knowledge, and a very individual taste. The following morning, when we met on the Corso, he placed himself at my disposal if he could be of use to me. There was nothing he had arranged to do. He asked where I was thinking of going. As he knew Rome and its neighborhood as well as I knew my mother's drawing-room, I placed myself in his hands. We took a carriage and drove together, first to the baths of Caracalla, then to the catacombs, where we very nearly lost our way, and thought with a thrill of what in olden times must have been the feelings of the poor wretches who fled there, standing in the dark and hearing footsteps in the distance, knowing that it was their pursuers coming, and that they were inevitably going to be murdered, where there was not even room to raise a weapon in their own defense. Next we drove to San Paolo Fuori le Mura, of the burning of which Thorwaldson's museum possesses a painting by Leopold Robert, but which at that time had been entirely rebuilt in the antique style. It was the most beautiful basilica I had ever seen. We enjoyed the sight of the courtyard of the monastery, nearly 1700 years old, with its fine pillars, all different, and so well preserved that we compared, in thought, the impressions produced by the 2 mighty churches, San Paolo and San Pietro. Then we dined together and plunged into interminable discussions until darkness fell. From that day forth, we were inseparable. Our companionship lasted several months, until I was obliged to journey north. But the same cordial relations continued to subsist between us for more than a quarter of a century, when death robbed me of my friend. George's Neuflard was the son of a rich cloth manufacturer at Roubaix, and at an early age had come into possession of a considerable fortune. This, however, was somewhat diminished through the dishonesty of those who, after the death of his father, conducted the works in his name. He had wanted to become a painter, but the weakness of his eyes had obliged him to give up art. Now he was an art lover and was anxious to write a book on the memorials and works of art in Rome, too great an undertaking, and for that reason never completed. But at the same time, he pursued with passion the study of music, played Beethoven, Gluck and Berlioz for me daily, and later on published books on Berlioz and Richard Wagner. As a youth he had been an enthusiast such as, in the Germanic countries, they fancy is impossible elsewhere, to such an extent indeed as would be regarded even there as extraordinary. At 17 years of age, he fell in love with a young girl who lived in the same building as himself. He was only on terms of sign language with her, had not even secured so much as a conversation with her. Nonetheless, his infatuation was so great that he declared to his father that he wished to marry her. The father would not give his consent, and her family would not receive him unless he was presented by his father. The latter sent him to America with the words, "Forget your love and learn what a fine thing industrialism is." He traveled all over the United States, found all machinery loathsome, since he had not the most elementary knowledge of the principles of mechanics and no inclination for them, and thought all the time of the little girl from whom they wished to separate him. It did not help matters that the traveling companion that had been given him lived and breathed in an atmosphere of the lowest debauchery, and did his best to initiate the young man into the same habits. On his return home, he declared to his father that he persisted in his choice. "Good," said his father, "Asia Minor is a delightful country, and so is Northern Africa. It will also do you good to become acquainted with Italy." So he set off on his travels again, and this time was charmed with everything he saw. Then his father died, and he became pretty much his own master and free to do as he liked. Then he learned that the father of the girl had been guilty of a bank fraud. His family would not receive hers, if indeed herself. So he gave up his intention. He did not wish to expose her to humiliation, and did not wish himself to have a man of ill fame for his father-in-law. He set off again on his travels, and remained a long time away. "The proof that I acted wisely by so doing," he said in conclusion, "is that I have completely forgotten the girl. My infatuation was all fancy." When he commenced by telling me that for 3 years he had loved, and despite all opposition, wished to marry a girl to whom he had never spoken, I exclaimed, "Why, you are no Frenchman." When he concluded by telling me that after remaining constant for 3 years, he had abandoned her for a fault that not she, but her father, had committed, I exclaimed, "How French you are, after all." While mutual political, social, and philosophical interests drew me to Giuseppe Cerdo, all the artistic side of my nature bound me to George's Neuflard. Cerdo was an Italian from a half-French part. He was born at Savona, near Chambéry, and his culture was as much French as Italian. Neuflard was a Frenchman possessed by such a love for Italy that he spoke the purest Florentine, felt himself altogether a Southerner, and had made up his mind to take up his permanent abode in Italy. He married, too, a few years afterwards, a lovely Florentine woman, and settled down in Florence. What entirely won my heart about him was the femininely delicate consideration and unselfish devotion of his nature, the charm there was about his manner and conversation, which revealed itself in everything he did, from the way in which he placed his hat upon his head, to the way in which he admired a work of art. But I could not have associated with him day after day had I not been able to learn something from him. When we met again 10 years later, it turned out that we had nothing especially new to tell each other. I had met him just at the right moment. It was not only that Neuflard was very well and widely informed about the artistic treasures of Italy and the places where they were to be found, but his opinions enriched my mind, inasmuch as they spurred me on to contradiction or surprised me and won my adherence. Fresh as Julius Lange's artistic sense had been, there was nevertheless something doctrinaire and academic about it. An artist like Bernini was horrible and nothing else to him. He had no sympathy for the sweet, half-sensual ecstasy of some of Bernini's best figures. He was an enemy of 18th-century art in France, saw it through the moral spectacles which in the Germanic countries had come into use with the year 1800. It was easy for Neuflard to remain unbiased by Northern doctrines, for he did not know them. He had the free eye of the beauty lover for every revelation of beauty, no matter under what form, and had the intellectual kinship of the Italianized Frenchman for many an artist unappreciated in the North. On the other hand, he naturally considered that we Northmen very much overestimated our own. It was impossible to rouse any interest in him for Thorwaldsen, whom he considered absolutely academic. "You cannot call him a master in any sense," he exclaimed one day when we had been looking at Thorwaldsen bas-reliefs side by side with antiques. I learnt from my intimacy with Neuflard how little impression Thorwaldsen's spirit makes on the Romance peoples. That indifference to him would soon become so widespread in Germany, I did not yet foresee. Neuflard had a very alert appreciation of the early Renaissance, especially in sculpture. He was passionately in love with the natural beauties of Italy from north to south, and he had a kind of national psychological gift of singling out peculiarly French, Italian, or German traits. He did not know the German language, but he was at home in German music and had studied a great deal of German literature in translation. Just then, he was reading Hegel's Aesthetics, the abstractions in which veritably alarmed him and to which he very much preferred modern French art philosophy. In English science, he had studied Darwin, and he was the first to give me a real insight into the Darwinian theory and a general summary of it, for in my younger days I had only heard it attacked, as erroneous, in lectures by Rasmus Nielsen on teleology. Georges Neuflard was the first Frenchman of my own age with whom I had been intimate, and whose character I partly understood and entered into, partly absorbed into my own. If many of the various opinions evident in my first lectures were strikingly emancipated from Danish national prejudices, which no one hitherto had attempted to disturb, I owed this in a great measure to him. Our happy, harmonious intimacy in the Sabine Hills and in Naples was responsible, before a year was past, for whole deluges of abuse in Danish newspapers. 6. One morning, the consul's manservant brought me a permesso for the collection of sculpture in the Vatican for the same day, and a future permesso for the loggias, stanzas, and the Sistine Chapel. I laid the last in my pocketbook. It was the key of paradise. I had waited for it so long that I said to myself almost superstitiously, I wonder whether anything will prevent again. The anniversary of the day I had left Copenhagen the year before, I drove to the Vatican, went at 1 o'clock midday up the handsome staircase, and through immense, in part, magnificently decorated rooms to the Sistine Chapel. I had heard so much about the disappointment it would be that not the very slightest suggestion of disappointment crossed my mind. Only a feeling of supreme happiness shot through me. At last I am here. I stood on the spot which was the real goal of my pilgrimage. I had so often examined reproductions of every figure, and I had read so much about the whole, that I knew every note of the music beforehand. Now I heard it. A voice within me whispered, so here I stand at last, shut in with the mind that of all human minds has spoken most deeply home to my soul. I am outside and above the earth and far from humankind. This is his earth, and these are his men, created in his image to people his world. For this one man's work is a world, which, though that of one man only, can be placed against the productions of a whole nation, even of the most splendid nation that has ever lived, the Greeks. Michelangelo felt more largely, more lonely, more mightily than any other. He created out of the wealth of a nature that in its essence was more than earthly. Raphael is more human, people say, and that is true, but Michelangelo is more divine. After the lapse of about an hour, the figures detached themselves from the throng to my mental vision, and the whole composition fixed itself in my brain. I saw the ceiling, not merely as it is today, but as it was when the colors were fresh, for in places there were patches, the bright yellow, for instance, which showed the depth of coloring in which the whole had been carried out. It was Michelangelo's intention to show us the ceiling pierced and the heavens open above it. Up to the central figures, we are to suppose that the walls continue straight up to the ceiling, as though the figures sat upright. Then all confusion disappears, and all becomes one perfect whole. The principal pictures, such as the creation of Adam, Michelangelo's most philosophical and most exquisite painting, I had had before my eyes upon my wall every day for 10 years. The expression in Adam's face was not one of languishing appeal, as I had thought. He smiled faintly, as if calmly confident of the dignity of the life the finger of God is about to bestow upon him. The small, bronze-painted figures expressed the suspension and repose of the ceiling. They were architectonic symbols. The troops of young heroes round about the central pillars were Michelangelo's ideals of youth, beauty, and humanity. The one resting silently and thoughtfully on one knee is perhaps the most splendid. There is hardly any difference between his build and that of Adam. Adam is the more spiritual brother of these young and suffering heroes. I felt the injustice of all the talk about the beginnings of grotesqueness in Michelangelo's style. There are a few somewhat distorted figures, Hammon, the knot of men and women adoring the snake, Jonas, as he flings himself backwards, but except these, what calm, what grandiose perfection, and which was still more remarkable, what imposing charm. Eve, in the picture of the fall, is perhaps the most adorable figure that art has ever produced. Her beauty, in the picture on the left, was like a revelation of what humanity really ought to have been. It sounded almost like a lie that one man had created this in 22 months. Would the earth ever again produce frescoes of the same order? The 360 years that had passed over it had damaged this, the greatest pictorial work on earth, far less than I had feared. A large aristocratic English family came in, man, wife, son, daughter, another daughter, the governess, all expensively and fashionably dressed. They stood silent for a moment at the entrance to the hall. Then they came forward as far as about the middle of the hall, looked up and about a little, said to the custodian, "Will you open the door for us?" and went out again very gracefully. 7. I knew Raphael's loggias from copies in L'École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, but I was curious to see how they would appear after this, and so, although there was only 3/4 of an hour left of the time allotted to me on my permesso, I went up to look at them. My first impression, as I glanced down the corridor and perceived these small ceiling pictures barely 2 feet across, was, good gracious, this will be a sorry enjoyment after Michelangelo. I looked at the first painting, God creating the animals, and was quite affected. There goes the good old man, saying paternally, "Come up from the earth, all of you, you have no idea how nice it is up here." My next impression was, how childish, but my last was, what genius, how charming the picture of the fall and how lovely Eve, and what grandeur of style despite the smallness of the space. A God a few inches high separates light from darkness, but there is omnipotence in the movement of his arm. Jacob sees the ladder to heaven in his dream, and this ladder, which altogether has 6 angels upon it, seems to reach from earth to heaven, infinitely long and infinitely peopled. Above, we see God the Father, at an immense distance, spread his gigantic embrace, which covers a space the length of 2 fingers. There was the favorite picture of my childhood, Abraham prostrated before the angels, even more marvelous in the original than I had fancied it to myself, although it is true that the effect of the picture is chiefly produced by its beauty of line. And there was Lot, departing from Sodom with his daughters, a picture great because of the perfect illusion of movement. They go on, against the wind and storm, with horror behind them and hope in front, at the back, to the right, the burning city to the left, a smiling landscape. How unique the landscapes on all these pictures are, how marvelous, for instance, that in which Moses is found on the Nile. This river, within the narrow limits of the picture, looked like a huge stream, losing itself in the distance. It was 5:30. My back was beginning to ache in the place, which had grown tender from lying so long. Without a trace of fatigue, I had been looking uninterruptedly at pictures for 4 hours and a half. 8. Neuflard's best friend in Rome was a young lieutenant of the Bersaglieri named Ottavio Cerati, with whom we were much together. Although a Roman, he had entered the Italian army very young, and had consequently been, as it were, banished. Now, through the breach at Porta Pia, he had come back. He was 24 years of age, and the naivest Don Juan one could possibly meet. He was beloved by the beautiful wife of his captain, and Neuflard, who frequented their house, one day surprised the 2 lovers in tears. Cerati was crying with his ladylove because he had been faithless to her. He had confessed to her his intimacy with 4 other young ladies, so she was crying, and the end of it was that he cried to keep her company. At meals he gave us a full account of his principal romance. He had one day met her by chance in the gardens of the Palazzo Corsini, and since that day they had had secret meetings. But the captain had now been transferred to Terni, and tragedy had begun. Letters were constantly within an ace of being intercepted. They committed imprudences without count. He read aloud to us, without the least embarrassment, the letters of the lady. The curious thing about them was the moderation she exercised in the expression of her love, while at the same time her plans for meetings were of the most foolhardy, breakneck description. Another fresh acquaintance that I made in those days was with 3 French painters, Hammond, Sain, and Benner, who had studios adjoining one another. Hammond and Sain both died long since, but Benner, whom I met again in Paris in 1904, died, honored and respected, in 1905. I was later on at Capri in company with Sain and Benner, but Hammond I saw only during this visit to Rome. His pretty, somewhat sentimental painting, Massoa ni est pas, hung, reproduced in engraving, in every shop window, even in Copenhagen. He was painting just then at his clever picture, Trist Rivage. Hammond was born in Brittany, of humble, orthodox parents who sent him to a monastery. The prior, when he surprised him drawing men and women out of his head, told him that painting was a sin. The young man himself then strongly repented his inclination, but as he felt he could not live without following it, he left the monastery, though with many strong twinges of conscience. Now that he was older, he was ruining himself by drink, but had manifested true talent and still retained a humorous wit. One day that I was with him, a young man came to the studio and asked for his opinion of a painting. The man talked the whole time of nothing but his mother, of how much he loved her and all that he did for her. Hammond's patience gave out at last. He broke out, And do you think, sir, that I have murdered my mother? I love her very much, I assure you, not enough to marry her, I grant, but pretty well all the same. After that he always spoke of him as the young man who loves his mother. 9. I felt as though this April, this radiant spring, were the most glorious time in my life. I was assimilating fresh impressions of art and nature every hour. The conversations I was enjoying with my Italian and French friends set me day by day pondering over new thoughts. I saw myself restored to life and a better life. At the beginning of April, moreover, some girls from the north made their triumphal entry into the Scandinavian club. Without being specially beautiful or remarkable, they absolutely charmed me. It was a full year since the language of home had sounded in my ears from the lips of a girl, since I had seen the smile in the blue eyes and encountered the heart-ensnaring charm, in jest or earnest, of the young women of the north. I had recently heard the entrancing castrato singing at St. Peter's, and on conquering my aversion, could not but admire it. Now I heard once more simple, but natural Danish and Swedish songs. Merely to speak Danish again with a young woman was a delight, and there was one who, delicately and unmistakably and defenselessly, showed me that I was not indifferent to her. That melted me, and from that time forth the beauties of Italy were enhanced tenfold in my eyes. All that I was acquainted with in Rome, all that I saw every day with George's Neuflard, I could show her and her party from the most accessible things, which were nevertheless fresh to the newcomers, such as the Pantheon, Acqua Paula, San Pietro in Montorio, the grave of Cecilia Mitella, and the grottos of Egeria, to the great collections of art in the Vatican, or the Capitol, or in the wonderful Galleria Borghese. All this that I was accustomed to see alone with Neuflard acquired new splendor when a blonde girl walked by my side, asking sensible questions and showing me the gratitude of youth for good instruction. With her 19 years, I suppose, she thought me marvelously clever. But the works of art that lay a little outside the beaten track, I likewise showed to my compatriots. I had never been able to tolerate Guido Reni, but his playing angels in the chapel of San Gregorio excited my profound admiration, and it was a satisfaction to me to pour this into the receptive ear of a girl compatriot. These angels delighted me so that I could hardly tear myself away from them. The fine malice, the mild coquetry, even in the expression of the noblest purity and the loftiest dignity, enchanted us. I had been in the habit of going out to the environs of Rome with George's Neuflard, for instance, to the large, handsome gardens of the Villa Doria Pamphili, or the Villa Madama, with its beautiful frescoes and stucwork, executed by Raphael's pupils, Giulio Romano and others from drawings by that master. But it was a new delight to drive over the Campagna with a girl who spoke Danish by my side, and to see her northern complexion in the sun of the south. With my French friend, I gladly joined the excursions of her party to Nemi, Albano, Tivoli. Never in my life had I felt so happy as I did then. I was quite recovered. Only a fortnight after I had risen from a sickbed that had claimed me 4 months and a half, I was going about, thanks to my youth, as I did before I was 99. For my excursions, I had a comrade after my own heart, well-bred, educated, and noble-minded. I fell in love a little a few times a week. I saw lakes, fields, olive groves, mountains, scenery, exactly to my taste. I had always a permesso for the Vatican collections in my pocket. I felt intoxicated with delight, dizzy with enjoyment. It seemed to me that of all I had seen in the world, Tivoli was the most lovely. The old temple of the Sibyl on the hill stood on consecrated ground and consecrated the whole neighborhood. I loved those waterfalls, which impressed me much more than Trollhättan. Footnote: Trollhättan, a celebrated waterfall near Göteborg in Sweden, had done in my childhood. In one place the water falls down, black and boiling, into a hollow of the rock, and reminded me of the descent into Tartarus. In another the cataract runs, smiling and twinkling with millions of shining pearls in the strong sunlight. In a third place, the great cascade rushes down over the rocks. There, where it touches the nether rocks, rests the end of the enormous rainbow which, when the sun shines, is always suspended across it. Neuflard told me that Niagara itself impressed one less. We scrambled along the cliff until we stood above the great waterfall and could see nothing but the roaring, foaming white water leaping and dashing down. It looked as though the seething and spraying masses of water were springing over each other's heads in a mad race, and there was such power, such natural persuasion in it, that one seemed drawn with it, and gliding, as it were, dragged into the abyss. It was as though all nature were disembodied and flinging herself down. Like a Latin, Neuflard personified it all. He saw the dance of nymphs in the waves and their veils in the clouds of spray. My way of regarding nature was diametrically opposite and pantheistic. I lost consciousness of my own personality, felt myself one with the falling water, and merged myself into nature, instead of gathering it up into figures. I felt myself an individuality of the north, conscious of my being. One afternoon, a large party of us had taken our meal at an inn on the lake of Nemi. The evening was more than earthly. The calm, still mountain lake, the old, filled-up crater on the top of the mountain, had a fairy-like effect. I dropped down behind a boulder and lay for a long time alone, lost in ecstasy, out of sight of the others. All at once, I saw a blue veil fluttering in the breeze quite near me. It was the young Danish girl who had sat down with me. The red light of the evening, Nemi and she merged in one. Not far away, some people were setting fire to a blaze of twigs and leaves. One solitary bird warbled across the lake. The cypresses wept. The pines glowered. The olive trees bathed their foliage in the mild warmth. One cloud sailed across the sky, and its reflection glided over the lake. One could not bear to raise the voice. It was like a muffled concert. Here were life, reality, and dreams. Here were sun, warmth, and light. Here were color, form, and line, and in this line, outlined by the mountains against the sky, the artistic background of all the beauty. Neuflard and I accompanied our northern friends from Albano to the station. They were going on as far as Naples, and thence returning home. We said goodbye and walked back to Albano in the mild summer evening. The stars sparkled and shone bright. Cassiopeia showed itself in its most favorable position, and Charles's Wain stood, as if in sheer high spirits, on its head, which seemed to be its recreation just about this time. It, too, was evidently a little dazed this unique, inimitable spring.